The black was the same everywhere. That was the first thing Djarin noticed when the screaming stopped. The portal had lasted 11 seconds. He had counted them, a Mandalorian habit, measuring danger in heartbeats, while the razor crest shook itself apart around him and Grogu screamed from his seat in the co-pilot's cradle, small hands pressed flat against the viewport as if he could hold the universe together through sheer will. The hyperspace-adjacent tunnel had been nothing like a jump. There were no blue streaks, no tunnel geometry, no familiar compression of starlight. There had been color without name, sound without frequency, pressure without source. And then, between one breath and the next, there was only the black again. Grogu's hands dropped to his lap. His enormous eyes, usually bright with curiosity or mischief, were glassy and unfocused. He made a sound Din had never heard from him before. Not his hungry sound, not his frightened sound, but something quieter and more unsettling. The sound of exhaustion so complete it bordered on absence. Din was out of his seat before the instrument panel finished its damage assessment, kneeling beside the co-pilot cradle with one gauntlet hand resting on Grogu's back, feeling the small ribcage rise and fall. "I've got you," he said. "I've got you, kid." Grogu's ears drooped. He leaned his head against Din's forearm and closed his eyes. Din held that position for 30 seconds, longer than tactical sense allowed, shorter than he wanted, and then stood and returned to the pilot's seat, because someone had to figure out where they were. The answer, delivered by the Crest's navigation system in the flat tone of a machine that did not understand the magnitude of what it was reporting, was, unknown. Star charts returned no matches. The constellations visible through the viewport bore no relationship to any catalog in the Crest's database. The nearest star was a yellow dwarf approximately 6 light-minutes distant, orbited by a system of planets showing signs of terraforming, a technology Din knew, could recognize, but the atmospheric processors on 2 of those planets were running a design architecture he had never encountered. Not Imperial. Not New Republic. Not anything. He ran the communication array next. Nothing on Imperial frequencies. Nothing on New Republic bands. Nothing on the encrypted bounty hunter network he still monitored out of old habit. What he found instead was a wash of civilian chatter, military channels running encryption protocols he didn't recognize, and an automated navigation beacon broadcasting in a dialect of English that his translator handled easily enough but which contained terminology and reference points that meant nothing to him. A place called Persephone. An authority called the Alliance. A currency called credits, which was at least familiar in name if nothing else. He sat with that for a long moment. Grogu was asleep. The Crest was running on 3/4 power. They had food and water for 6 weeks, fuel for approximately 4, weapons for considerably longer. Wherever they were not going back the way they came, not without the kid, and the kid was in no condition to open anything. Din pulled up the passive sensor array and began the process he knew better than almost any other, assessing threat, cataloging environment, identifying options. The Georgia system, that was the name the beacon used, contained traffic. Merchant vessels, a small Alliance patrol craft moving in a distant arc around the system's 4th planet, and one other ship. A mid-bulk transport of a design he didn't know, running without a registered transponder signal, holding position approximately 40,000 kilometers off his port bow. They had been there when he arrived. That meant they had seen everything. Din reached for the weapons console and brought the Crest's cannons online without powering them to active fire. A precaution. The gesture of a man who had survived this long precisely because he treated every unknown as a loaded weapon until proven otherwise. The transport didn't move. Didn't hail. Just watched. He gave them 4 minutes to make the first move. When they didn't, he keyed the comm. Unidentified vessel. You have eyes on my position. I'm aware of that. I'm not a threat to you and I have no interest in your cargo. State your intentions and we'll part ways. Static for a moment. Then a voice came back, male, unhurried, carrying the specific weight of a man accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in any room he chose to enter. Well now. That's an interesting ship you've got there, friend. Interesting entrance, too. In my experience, vessels that appear out of a hole in space tend to bring complications with them. I'm not real fond of complications. Then keep your distance and we'll have no problem. A pause. See, here's my difficulty. That entry point of yours lit up every passive sensor I've got running. Which means it lit up everything else in this system, too. Alliance patrol out there's going to change course in about 9 minutes when their delayed sensor feed catches up with their processing time. I've done this math before. You want to be gone before that happens, or you want to sit here and have a philosophical discussion about personal space. Din looked at Grogu, still asleep. Looked at the NAV system, still returning no matches. Looked at the fuel gauge. What do you want? He said. Conversation, the voice said. My crew's seen a lot of strange things in the black. Never seen a ship come out of nowhere wrapped in light like that. Never seen armor like yours either, from what my sensors are telling me. I'm a curious man. Dangerous habit, I know. Curiosity gets people killed. So does floating in open space with an Alliance patrol 9 minutes from a sensor contact. Another pause, shorter this time. I'm Mal, captain of the Serenity. I'm extending an offer of temporary hospitality. You come alongside, we talk, you tell me what I'm looking at, and I'll tell you what I know about the Alliance's likely response time. Seems like a fair trade. Din's hand rested on the weapons console. Every instinct he had developed across years of bounty work and war said. Decline, run, trust nobody. But the fuel gauge said 4 weeks, the NAV system said unknown, and Grogu's slow breathing said that whatever came next, it could not be solved alone. If anyone on your ship points a weapon at the child with me, I'll put a hole in your hull before you finish the order. Mal's reply was immediate. I've got a strict policy about shooting children. We'll get along fine. Din brought the crest alongside and cut thrust to minimal hold. Through the viewport, the transport called Serenity resolved from a shape into a vessel, old, patched, asymmetrical in the way of something that had been repaired with whatever was available rather than what was correct. He had flown ships like that. He understood ships like that. He looked one more time at Grogu, who had curled himself into the co-pilot cradle with his hands tucked under his chin, ears slack, chest rising and falling with the slow rhythm of deep sleep. If you want to see more characters cross into strange universes, hit that subscribe button and drop a name in the comments below. Live long and prosper, and this is the way. He picked Grogu up with the careful practiced ease of long habit, settled him against his chest plate, and walked toward the boarding hatch. Whatever the Serenity was, whatever this universe turned out to be, he had walked into worse with less. And he had the child. That was enough to start with. Serenity smelled like engine grease, protein rations, and the particular human odor of people living close together in a small space for a long time. Din recognized it immediately. It was the smell of every outpost, every covert, every cramped bunkhouse he had ever sheltered in. The smell of people who had chosen survival over comfort and made their peace with that bargain. He came through the docking collar with Grogu held against his left side, his right hand free and loose near his blaster. He had left the Beskar spear locked in the crest's weapon rack, a calculated gesture. Enough restraint to signal non-aggression. Not enough to signal weakness. They were waiting for him in the cargo bay. 6 of them, arranged in the unconscious tactical geometry of people who had done this before, spread wide enough to prevent a single line of fire from taking them all, close enough to support each other. Din catalogued them in the first 2 seconds. The man in the center. Medium height, lean, brown coat, the posture of someone who had been a soldier and never entirely stopped. A woman to his left, dark-haired, carrying herself with a stillness that meant she was the second most dangerous person in the room. A large man near the staircase with his arms crossed, watching Din's armor with an expression that moved between suspicion and calculation. A young woman in coveralls with engine oil on her forearms who was staring at Grogu with unconcealed wonder. A man in a shepherd's collar standing slightly apart, hands clasped, whose eyes were doing something far more careful than his posture suggested. And slightly behind all of them, at the edge of the staircase's shadow, a young woman who was not looking at Din at all. She was looking at Grogu. Not with wonder, the way the mechanic was. With recognition. Din filed that away and returned his attention to the man in the brown coat. "Malcolm Reynolds," the man said. "We spoke on the comm. This is my ship and my crew. Nobody here is going to give you trouble unless you start some." Din Djarin. He didn't offer a hand. Neither did Mal. They understood each other well enough without it. "That's a remarkable piece of kit you're wearing," Mal said, nodding at the Beskar. "Never seen armor plate that color. What's the alloy?" "Not something you'll find in this system." "No," Mal agreed, studying him with the patient attention of a man who had learned to read people the way others read star charts. "I don't imagine it is." "What about him?" Grogu had woken during the docking approach, roused by the clanking of the collar mechanism, and was now regarding the assembled crew of Serenity from the crook of Din's arm with the alert, evaluative expression he wore when processing new information. His ears were raised, a good sign, Din had learned. Ears down meant fear or exhaustion. Ears up meant curiosity. He was curious. "He's mine," Din said. The word didn't quite cover it, but it covered everything that mattered. "He's got the biggest eyes I have ever seen," the mechanic said from behind Mal, in a tone of pure delight. Is it okay if I? "Kaylee," Mal said, without sharpness. "I'm just saying he's extraordinary." Grogu, who had been watching Kaylee with those raised ears, suddenly reached one small hand toward her. It was not a forced gesture, just the simple reaching of a small creature toward something that felt warm. Kaylee made a sound that was almost a word and pressed both hands against her mouth. "What is he?" the large man near the staircase asked. His voice carried the blunt directness of someone who had found that bluntness saved time. "Jane," Mal said. "It's a legitimate question." "He's 50 years old," Din said, which produced a silence of the specific quality that followed genuinely unexpected information. "His species ages slowly. He's a child by his people's reckoning." 50 years, the shepherd said quietly. He was looking at Grogu with an expression Din couldn't fully read, something between theological interest and something more personal. "And what can he do?" "That arrival of yours wasn't any technology I've encountered." "He opened a door," Din said. "He didn't mean to. We're working on getting back." "A door," Mal repeated. He let the word sit for a moment, turning it over. "Right. I'm going to need considerably more than that before I file it away and move on. But first," he looked past Din toward the docking collar. "The Alliance patrol that picked up your entry signature is going to be running intercept calculations right now. I've put some distance between us and your entry point, but an unregistered ship with exotic hull composition sitting in my docking collar is the kind of thing that tends to generate paperwork I'd rather avoid. I need to know if they're going to find anything on you that brings them to my door. I have no record in any system you'll find in this universe," Din said. "I'm not in your databases." Mal looked at him for a long moment. "You're serious?" "The NAV charts on my ship don't show a single star in this system. Your universe and mine aren't the same place." The silence that followed was different in quality from the earlier one. The large man, Jane, unfolded his arms and then folded them again, apparently finding no useful physical response to this information. Kaylee looked from Din to Mal with the expression of someone hoping an adult would explain what was happening. The shepherd sat down on a cargo crate with the deliberate care of a man organizing his thoughts. Mal said, "Zoe." The dark-haired woman to his left nodded once. "I'll get us moving." "Rim ward, avoid the patrol lane." "Rim ward," Mal confirmed. Best speed that doesn't look like we're running. Zoe moved without another word, up the stairs and forward toward the bridge with the economy of motion that characterized everything about her. Mal returned his attention to Din. All right, Mr. Djarin. I've been in the business of accepting strange things at face value long enough to take a run at believing you. Different universe. That's a thing I'm going to need a drink to sit with, but I've had stranger mornings. He gestured toward the common area above. Come up. Eat something if your biology allows it. Talk to me. Din didn't move immediately. His eyes had gone back to the young woman at the edge of the stairs, the one who had been watching Grogu. She hadn't moved during any of the conversation. Hadn't reacted to the revelation about parallel universes. She was still watching the child with that same expression of recognition, her head tilted at a slight angle, her dark eyes tracking Grogu's small movements with an attention that went beyond curiosity. Grogu was watching her back. And his ears, Din noticed, had not dropped once since she entered his field of vision. They were fully raised, fully forward, in the posture Din associated with Grogu's sensing another Force user. Who is she? Din asked quietly. Mal's expression changed. Not much. The man was practiced at keeping his face neutral, but something shifted in the set of his jaw. That's River. He paused, and the pause contained something complicated. She's my crew. She's looking at him like she knows him. River looks at a lot of things in ways that are hard to explain. Mal said it without dismissiveness, more like a man quoting a fact he had accepted after long resistance. Come up and eat. We'll talk about what you need to get home. And maybe. He glanced at River, then back at Din. Maybe River can tell us something about that door your boy opened, and why he opened it here. Din looked at Grogu. Grogu had extended his hand again, not toward Kaylee this time. Toward River. She didn't move toward him. She just looked at the small outstretched hand with an expression that, for the first time since Din had entered the cargo bay, contained something recognizable. It looked like relief. Din shifted Grogu's weight against his armor and walked toward the stairs. The common area of Serenity was exactly what the cargo bay had promised. Functional, worn, inhabited in the deep way that spoke of years rather than months. The table was scarred with the rings of 1,000 mugs and the marks of meals eaten in a hurry. The bench seats were patched with mismatched fabric. The overhead lighting flickered slightly on the port side, a repair deferred in favor of something more urgent, and the whole space smelled of protein rehydration packs and something spiced that someone had attempted to cook from scratch. It was, Din thought, the kind of place where people actually lived. Not a barracks. Not a bunkhouse. A home that happened to move. He sat at the far end of the table with his back to the wall and Grogu in his lap, which was not ideal tactically but was what Grogu required. The child had been awake since the docking approach but was operating at the particular low-energy frequency that followed significant force expenditure, alert enough to track movement, too depleted to do much about it. He sat with both hands wrapped around the edge of the table and watched the crew of Serenity settle into their seats with the patient, evaluative attention of a creature that had survived 5 decades by reading rooms accurately. Mal sat across from Din. Zoe had returned from the bridge once she had set their course, and she took the seat to Mal's left with the practiced ease of someone who had occupied that position for years. Jane planted himself at the opposite end of the table with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who had decided to reserve judgment but was not enjoying the process. Kaylee had brought food, actual food, not ration packs, a bowl of something that steamed and smelled of reconstituted vegetables and a protein Din's translator couldn't identify, and placed it in front of him without asking, then sat beside Zoe and watched Grogu with barely contained delight. The shepherd, Book, settled into a chair slightly apart from the table, hands folded, in the posture of a man who listened for a living. The pilot, a young man who had introduced himself as Wash with the cheerful energy of someone constitutionally incapable of treating a crisis as a crisis, had stayed on the bridge to manage their course but had made his feelings about missing the conversation loudly known before departing. River sat at the far corner of the table, nearest the corridor that led deeper into the ship. She had not spoken since the cargo bay. She had not stopped watching Grogu. Grogu had not stopped watching her. "All right," Mal said, pouring something amber into 2 cups and pushing one toward Din, who did not touch it. "Let's start with the practical and work toward the philosophical. You said your NAV charts don't match anything in this system. How far off are we talking?" "Every star in visible range is uncharted," Din said. "The constellations don't match any catalog my ship carries. The terraforming signatures on your planets are a design architecture I haven't encountered. Whatever mechanism your civilization uses for faster-than-light travel, it isn't hyperdrive. Pulse drive," Mal said. "Fusion-based. Gets you between planets in the Georgia system in a matter of days. Gets you between systems in weeks, months. There's no," he paused. "Hyperdrive. That's something else entirely. Faster. Much faster. Fold space." Din watched Mal process this with the attention of someone calibrating how much information was safe to share. In the end, the calculus was simple: he was in an unknown universe with a weakened child and 4 weeks of fuel. Hoarding information was a luxury he couldn't afford. "In my galaxy, crossing a system takes hours. Crossing between systems takes days at most. Your technology is behind what I'm used to working with, but it's recognizable. The principles are similar." "High praise," Zoe said, dry as desert sand. It wasn't meant as an insult. It wasn't taken as one. She held his gaze with a steadiness that reminded him, not unpleasantly, of certain Mandalorian warriors he had respected. She was measuring him the way he was measuring her, professionally, without hostility, with the clear understanding that hostility remained available if required. Mal leaned forward, elbows on the table. "You said the child opened the door. A door between universes. How does that work, exactly?" "He's force sensitive," Din said. "The force it's an energy field. Present in all living things. Some individuals can interact with it directly. Manipulate it. He's been trained in its use, but he's young and the ability is still developing. He sensed something through the dimensional barrier and reached toward it, and the reaching tore a passage." The table was quiet for a moment. "He sensed something," Book said, from his chair at the edge of the gathering. His voice was measured, careful, carrying the weight of a man choosing words the way a surgeon chose instruments. "Something specific? Something that called to him?" "That's what I don't know yet." Din looked at Grogu, who had turned his head toward Book with his ears raised. The child had a sensitivity to genuine spiritual inquiry that Din had never fully understood but had learned to respect. Whatever Book was, the interest he carried was real. "He can't tell me in words. He's never been able to. But he reached, and we ended up here, and whatever he reached toward." He stopped. Because Grogu had turned away from Book. He was looking at River again. And River, for the first time since they had sat down, had opened her mouth. "It wasn't a what," she said. Her voice was soft, with the cadence of someone translating from an interior language that didn't map cleanly onto speech. It was a who. She looked at Din directly, and her eyes were dark and very clear. "He felt me. From across whatever space separates where you were from where we are. He felt the shape of what I am and he thought," she paused. Her head tilted. "He thought he wasn't alone in it." The silence that followed was the kind that followed true things. Din looked at Grogu. Grogu was watching River with his ears fully forward and his large eyes bright, and in the set of his small face was an expression Din recognized because he had seen it before. In the moments when Grogu encountered another being who carried the Force, who existed in the same current of living energy that Grogu moved through every waking moment. Recognition. The relief of being understood. "What are you?" Din asked River. Not harshly. The way he would ask a sensor reading to clarify itself. Mal shifted at the head of the table. River is enhanced, River said, with a glance at Mal that contained something layered and private. The Academy took certain things that were present and made them larger. I hear what people are thinking. I feel what they feel before they have language for it. I perceive, she stopped again, frustrated by the limitation of sequential speech. There is a field. I've always known there was a field. Connecting living things. I couldn't name it. I didn't have a word for it. She nodded toward Grogu. He has been swimming in it since before he was born. He recognized the shape of someone else standing at the edge of the same water. Jane uncrossed and recrossed his arms. So the baby is psychic and so is River, and that's why we're here. That's what you're saying. It's more than that, Book said quietly. He was looking at River with an expression that had moved past theological interest into something more urgent. What River is describing, a field connecting all living things, perceivable by those with a particular sensitivity, that's not a new idea. That's a very old one. The Force isn't unique to my universe, Din said. He said it slowly, working through it as he spoke, the way he worked through a tactical problem by talking it aloud to Grogu on long flights. Or, it isn't confined to it. It exists here too. Differently. Quietly. But Grogu felt it, and he felt her in it, and that was enough. River was nodding. Small, precise nods, as if he were reading from a text she had already memorized. Grogu had released the edge of the table and was now reaching toward her across the distance between them, both arms extended, in the gesture Din associated with children reaching for someone they trusted. River looked at the small outstretched hands. Something moved across her face, not quite emotion, more the shadow emotion cast on someone who felt everything at a volume most people never experienced. She looked at Mal with a question in her expression. Mal looked at Din. Din looked at his son. He had made a decision in the cargo bay, standing at the edge of the boarding collar, when he had seen the recognition in River's eyes and the answering brightness in Grogu's. Grogu was weakened. Depleted in ways Din couldn't fix, couldn't armor against, couldn't solve with the blaster or the spear. What Grogu needed was something Din could not provide. He could protect the child's body. He could not replenish what the crossing had cost him. But River Tam, standing at the edge of the same river, might be able to offer something Din never could. You can sit with him, Din said. He kept his voice level and allowed no room for ambiguity about the terms. Not alone. And the first time he pulls away, that's the end of it. River slipped from her seat and walked to Din's end of the table with the light, precise movement of someone who had learned to navigate the world very carefully. She sat down beside Din, close enough for Grogu to reach, far enough not to crowd, and held out her hands, palms up, the way someone might offer a landing surface to a small frightened bird. Grogu looked at her hands. Looked up at her face. Looked back at her hands. Then he placed both of his small three-fingered hands in hers and closed his eyes. River's breath went out slowly. Her shoulders dropped, very slightly, from a tension so habitual she probably no longer felt it. Her eyes closed too. The table was utterly quiet. Even Jane didn't speak. After 30 seconds, River opened her eyes. There were no tears in them, her control was too complete for that. But her expression had changed in a way that was difficult to articulate. Softer. Less defended. As if something she had carried alone for a long time had, for 30 seconds, been carried by two. He's tired, she said. Very tired. But he's not broken. What he did, she paused, searching for language. What he did took everything he had. He'll recover. He just needs time and something to eat. Her eyes moved to the bowl of food Kaylee had placed in front of Din, then to Din himself. Din picked up the bowl and set it in front of Grogu without a word. Grogu opened his eyes, looked at the bowl, looked up at Din with an expression of straightforward expectation, and reached for the spoon. Kaylee made the sound again, the one that was almost a word. Wash's voice came over the ship's intercom. Whatever's happening in there, it sounds either very sweet or very concerning, and I'd like a report when convenient. Mal picked up his cup and took a long drink. He set it down, looked at the ceiling, and said, to no one in particular, different universe. Right. Okay. Outside Serenity's hull, in the patient dark of the Georgia system's outer belt, the Alliance patrol had completed its course correction. Its sensors were running a focused sweep of the area surrounding the anomalous energy signature logged 47 minutes prior. The sweep would find nothing where the Razor Crest had been. The ship was gone, docked to a mid-bulk transport whose registry showed clean, Serenity, out of Persephone, in transit, unremarkable. But the energy signature had already been logged. Already been transmitted. Already been received, on a priority channel, by a man in a dark coat who was currently reading the report in a private cabin aboard an Alliance cruiser 4 systems away, with the careful attention of someone who had learned never to dismiss anomalies. The operative folded the report precisely in half and sat for a moment in the quiet. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and went to inform his superiors that something new had entered the Traverse. The Alliance patrol vessel IAV Resolute was not a warship by any practical definition. It was a patrol cutter, 200 meters of functional gray hull, minimal armament, designed for the unglamorous work of system monitoring, customs enforcement, and the maintenance of order in the quieter corners of the Georgia system. Its commander, Senior Lieutenant Harkin, had spent 11 years in the Alliance Navy distinguishing himself through thoroughness rather than brilliance, which was precisely why he had been assigned to patrol duty in a system that generated, on average, 2 incidents of note per standard year. He was therefore not accustomed to reading sensor logs that made him sit very still at his console for a long moment before reaching for the priority communication panel. The anomalous entry signature had been logged automatically. That was standard. The system flagged anything that didn't match known drive profiles, and pulse drive had a very specific signature that the sensors were calibrated to recognize. What the Resolute sensors had logged 47 minutes ago was not pulse drive. It was not anything in the Alliance's considerable database of known drive technologies. It was a burst of energy across 17 simultaneous frequency bands, a spatial distortion event lasting 11 seconds, and then the appearance of a vessel where no vessel had been, a vessel whose whole composition returned readings that the computer had classified, with what Harkin imagined was electronic bewilderment, as unknown alloy, exotic composition, no match in database. The vessel had then docked with a registered mid-bulk transport, Serenity, out of Persephone, clean registry. And both ships had moved rimward at a pace that was not quite running but was not idle either. Harkin had dispatched a standard intercept query to Serenity's registered comm channel. No response yet, which was not unusual for outer rim traffic. What was unusual was the energy signature. What was unusual was the hull composition reading. What was unusual was the fact that his navigation officer had run a quiet check and confirmed that the spatial distortion event bore no relationship to any known phenomenon, not a pulse drive malfunction, not a reactor breach, not a documented anomaly. Nothing. He filed his report through standard channels and then, because 11 years of thoroughness had taught him which reports warranted more than standard channels, he flagged it for priority routing to Parliament's Special Operations Liaison. He did not know precisely what that meant or who received those flags. He had been told, once, by a superior whose name he had been advised to forget, that certain anomalies were best brought to certain attentions without delay and without curiosity. He filed the flag, returned to his console, and resumed his patrol pattern. He was a thorough man. He knew when a thing was above his pay grade. For systems away, in the private cabin of an Alliance cruiser that appeared on no public registry, the operative read Harkin's report twice. He was a man who had trained himself out of most human reactions, surprise, fear, sentiment, the various forms of hesitation that compromise decisive action, but he had not trained himself out of recognition. He recognized the shape of an anomaly that mattered. He had spent his career excelling at the identification of variables that required management before they became crises, and the entry signature in Harkin's report had the specific character of a variable that, if left unmanaged, would become something considerably more difficult to address. An unknown vessel. Unknown hull composition. Spatial distortion entry consistent with no known technology. Docked with Serenity. Serenity. He sat with that for a moment. Malcolm Reynolds was a man he had been peripherally aware of for some time, not a priority, not a significant threat, a minor irritant in the category of Unification War veterans who had failed to accept the logical conclusion of that conflict. He smuggled. He evaded. He caused the kind of small, localized disorder that the Alliance tolerated because the cost of eliminating it exceeded the cost of enduring it. He was not interesting. But Serenity was currently carrying Simon and River Tam. River Tam was very interesting indeed. The operative set the report down and moved to his private console, where he composed a message to 3 separate Alliance intelligence contacts requesting full sensor data from the entry event, identification analysis of the unknown hull composition, and a current position track on Serenity. He worked quickly and without wasted motion. Then he sat back and allowed himself 60 seconds of pure thought, which was a luxury he rationed carefully. An unknown vessel appearing from a spatial anomaly, docking immediately with the ship carrying the Parliament's most sensitive unresolved liability. The timing could be coincidence. He did not believe in coincidence as a primary explanation. He believed in coincidence as the story you told yourself when you hadn't yet identified the real connection. He would find the connection. He always did. Aboard Serenity, Djarin was learning the layout of a ship he didn't own and might need to fight his way through. He did this the way he did most things, quietly, methodically, without announcing his intentions. After the meal, after Grogu had eaten his fill and fallen into a genuine restorative sleep in Kaylee's insistent offering of a hammock she had rigged in the engine room because, as she explained with absolute sincerity, the engine's vibration frequency was soothing and she would know, he had accepted Mal's offer of a tour with the specific attentiveness of a man memorizing a tactical environment. The ship was good. Not in the way that the Razor Crest was good. The crest was good the way a reliable weapon was good, purpose-built and unadorned, but in the way that something well-maintained against considerable odds was good. Every repair told a story about what had failed and what had been available to fix it. Every jury-rigged junction and replaced panel spoke to a crew that refused to let their home die quietly. Din respected that. Mal walked him through the ship with the proprietary ease of a man who knew every centimeter of his vessel and had made a calculated decision to extend a limited trust. He pointed out the relevant systems, engine room, bridge, infirmary, crew quarters, cargo bay, and the relevant rules, which amounted to, this is my ship, these are my people, and anyone who causes harm to either will find me considerably less hospitable than I have been today. Din understood those terms perfectly. They were his own, translated into a different voice. Your infirmary, Din said, pausing at the doorway. The room was small and well organized, a mix of what appeared to be standard medical equipment and several items that were clearly improvised or repurposed. Your medic. Simon, Mal said. He's currently indisposed. A pause containing something private. He'll be around. He's good. Better than good, if you need that kind of help. I don't. But the child might. I don't know what the crossing cost him at a biological level. He's recovering, but I want someone qualified to look at him when he wakes. Mal studied him. You trust a doctor you've known for 3 hours. I trust your assessment of him. You wouldn't keep a doctor aboard you didn't trust with your life, because at some point in any given month you need someone to do exactly that. Din met his gaze. I'm reading the ship. The ship tells me who you are. The corner of Mal's mouth shifted. Not quite a smile. The acknowledgement of a point fairly made. Simon will look at the boy when he's up. He won't hurt him. They finished the tour in the cargo bay, standing near the docking collar that connected to the Razor Crest, and Mal leaned against the hull with his arms crossed and asked the question that Din had been waiting for since the common area. What do you need to get back? What does it actually take? Grogu needs to recover fully. The crossing depleted him, he's operating well below capacity and I won't let him attempt anything like that again until he's completely restored. Din kept his voice level. The words were straightforward. The weight behind them, which was the weight of having watched his son collapse against his armor in the cockpit of the Crest, was his own business. Beyond that, I don't know. I've never crossed between universes. I don't know if it's possible to reverse the process deliberately or if we need to find a natural phenomenon that replicates the conditions. River might know, Mal said. River might know a great many things, Din said carefully. She's not dangerous to you or your boy, Mal said. The ease left his voice on that sentence, replaced by something harder and more direct. Whatever they did to her at the academy, whatever they made her into, she isn't a threat to people she's not pointed at. And she doesn't get pointed at children. He paused. She was a child herself when they took her. Din absorbed this. What did they do to her? Mal was quiet for a moment. The cargo bay hummed around them, the constant low vibration of the pulse drive, the creak of the hull adjusting to the slight temperature differential of open space. They opened up her brain, he said at last. Rewired parts of it. Enhanced certain abilities. Removed the buffer, I suppose you'd call it, between what she perceives and what she experiences. She hears thoughts. Feels emotions. Reads the shape of things before they happen. And she can't turn it off. Another pause. She told us once that it was like being in a room where everyone was shouting all the time and there were no walls. Din thought about Grogu. About the first months, when he had understood nothing about force sensitivity, nothing about what the child carried. About the way Grogu had reached toward other force users with something that looked, from outside, like desperate hunger. The reaching of something that had been isolated in its nature for too long and couldn't stop itself from seeking its own kind. He reached for her because she was the nearest thing to what he is, Din said slowly. In this universe. The closest echo of the Force. And she felt him back, Mal said. Across whatever distance separates your reality from ours. That's not small. No, Din agreed. It isn't. A sound from above, boots on the metal stairs. And Simon Tam appeared at the top of the cargo bay staircase, descending with the careful precision of a man who had grown up in environments where staircases were carpeted and had never entirely made peace with open metal grating. He was younger than Din had expected. Well dressed in a way that sat oddly against the worn interior of Serenity, the clothes of someone from a core world who hadn't yet found the wardrobe of the life he was actually living. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked at Din with the expression of a doctor automatically cataloging a patient, or, in this case, a heavily armed figure in exotic plate armor, for relevant medical information. You're the one with the child, Simon said. Yes. Mal says you want me to examine him. When he wakes. Not before. Din held Simon's gaze. He's been through a significant physical and neurological event. I need to know if there's any damage that isn't visible. Simon nodded with the brisk competence of someone for whom this was a solvable problem and therefore not worth excessive discussion. I'll need to understand his baseline physiology. I've never encountered his species. No one in my galaxy fully understands his species either, Din said. I'll tell you everything I know, which is less than it should be. You'll have to work from there. Simon appeared to find this professionally interesting rather than concerning, which Din took as a good sign. All right. When he wakes. He glanced at Mal. River's better today. Since he stopped. Looked at Din, made a visible decision about how much to say in front of a stranger. Since this morning. She's clearer. More present. The child, Mal said. Simon looked uncertain. I don't know what the mechanism would be. But yes. The timing correlates. He turned back to Din. What exactly is he? The last of something, Din said. Or close to it. Something that should have been protected and wasn't. Simon was quiet for a moment. The cargo bay hummed. Outside the hull, the Georgia system's dim light painted the viewport in pale amber. That, Simon said quietly, is something I understand completely. From the engine room above, through two bulkheads and the constant vibration of the drive, came a sound that Din had catalogued and stored in the particular archive he kept of things that made the long flights bearable. Small, sleepy, content. The sound of Grogu waking slowly from restorative sleep in a hammock that vibrated at exactly the right frequency, in a ship full of strangers who had, so far, kept their hands to themselves and their weapons holstered. Din allowed himself one moment of something that was not quite relief but was adjacent to it. Then he went back to memorizing the ship's layout, because relief was a feeling and feelings were fine in their place, and their place was not in the middle of an unknown universe with an Alliance patrol whose report had already been transmitted to people he hadn't met yet, and a man in a dark coat 4 systems away who was very good at his job. The universe, Din Djarin was beginning to understand, was not so different from the galaxy he knew. It was full of people who wanted things they hadn't earned, and other people trying to protect what they loved from the first group. He knew how to live in that world. He had been doing it his entire life. Grogu woke at the 3rd hour of Serenity's night cycle, in the particular way he woke when something had shifted in the force around him. Not with the startled jerk of nightmare but with a slow, deliberate surfacing, like a diver ascending from depth who knew exactly where the surface was and was in no hurry to reach it. His eyes opened in the dimness of the engine room, and the first thing he saw was the slow rotation of Serenity's compression coil, turning in its housing with the patient rhythm of a thing that had been turning for years and intended to keep doing so. The second thing he saw was Kaylee, asleep in her own hammock 6 feet away, one arm hanging loose, a technical manual open across her chest, her breathing slow and untroubled. Grogu regarded her for a moment with the evaluative attention he gave to all new things. Then he decided she was safe. He had decided this in the cargo bay, actually, within approximately 4 seconds of seeing her, because some people carried their intentions in a way that was legible to him at a level below conscious thought, and turned his attention inward. He took stock of himself the way Din had taught him, insofar as Din had been able to teach it. The Mandalorian was not force-sensitive, and his understanding of what the child experienced was built from observation and extrapolation rather than direct knowledge, but he had watched carefully enough and asked the right questions enough times that his guidance had real value. Grogu worked through his own interior landscape. Hands, functional, no tremor. Eyes, clear. The deep exhaustion of the crossing had lifted from his muscles and his bones, replaced by the lighter fatigue of genuine recovery. The force around him, and here was the difference, the thing that had disoriented him since the moment of arrival, was not absent but was thin. Quieter. Like a river that had narrowed without losing its current. In his own galaxy it had been wide and deep and present everywhere, the vast connected field that his training had only begun to teach him to navigate. Here it existed in a different register. Muted. Compressed. As if the universe itself was less practiced at carrying it. But it was there. And somewhere forward in the ship, past 2 bulkheads and a corridor and the common area, River Tam was sitting awake in the darkness and feeling it too. Grogu climbed out of the hammock with the careful deliberateness of someone whose legs were still slightly unsteady, landed on the deck plating without sound, and stood for a moment getting his balance. Then he began to walk. He navigated Serenity's night-quiet corridors with the confidence of a creature whose spatial memory was nearly perfect. He had mapped the ship during the waking hours with the same quiet thoroughness Din applied to tactical environments. Though for entirely different reasons. Where Din memorized exit routes and choke points, Grogu memorized where the warm things were. The living things. Their positions and their emotional textures and the way the thin current of the Force moved differently around each of them. The crew of Serenity was interesting. Mal Reynolds was a man who had broken in a specific place and rebuilt himself around the break, the way a bone healed denser at the fracture point. The grief and the anger in him were old and structural, not wounds anymore but load-bearing elements. Without them he would be a different shape entirely. Grogu did not feel threatened by this. He felt something more like recognition. He had sat with Din Djarin through enough silent nights to know what a man who had rebuilt himself around loss looked like from the inside. Zoe was quieter in the Force than almost anyone Grogu had encountered. Not absent. Present, very present, with the dense solidity of someone fully inhabiting their own existence, but deliberately contained. She kept herself gathered in a way that reminded Grogu of the Jedi texts he had absorbed in fragments, the descriptions of certain masters who had learned to compress their presence in the Force until they were nearly invisible to those who searched for them. Zoe had done this without training, without knowledge of the Force, purely through the discipline of survival. It was remarkable. Jane was simple and bright in the Force the way a fire was simple and bright, not complex, not hidden, entirely itself. He wanted things and feared things, and the things he wanted and the things he feared were not very different from each other, which was a pattern Grogu had noticed in many beings. He was not cruel at his center. He was frightened, and frightened beings reached for whatever felt solid, and what felt solid to Jane was strength and money and the familiar weight of a weapon. Grogu had no judgment about this. He had spent time with bounty hunters. Book was the most complex of the crew in the Force, and Grogu did not yet have enough information to fully parse what he was reading. There was depth there that didn't match the surface presentation, layers of history and knowledge in something that had been chosen and set aside and perhaps not entirely set aside. He felt, in the Force, like a room with a locked door in it. Grogu noted this and moved on. Locked doors were not his business unless they became relevant. River was the reason he was walking through the ship at the third hour of the night cycle. She was in the common area, sitting cross-legged on the table, not on the bench, on the table itself, in the center, with her hands resting palm up on her knees and her eyes open and her attention directed at something that wasn't in the room. Grogu rounded the corner from the corridor and stopped in the doorway and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them felt the need to address the fact that they had both known the other would be here. He walked to the table. She reached down and lifted him up, carefully, unhurried, as if she had been handling children his size her entire life, which she had not, and settled him in front of her so they were facing each other across 18 inches of scarred tabletop. In the thin current of the Force that ran through Serenity's hull and the Georgia system's quiet dark, something happened that had no precise name in any language spoken in either universe. River had lived her entire post-academy life in a condition of overwhelming reception. She received. She could not stop receiving. The thoughts and feelings and unconscious transmissions of every person within range poured into her continuously, and the work of every waking moment was the work of processing that volume without drowning in it. She had developed techniques, she thought of them as walls, though they were more like filters, permeable and imperfect, and the techniques helped, most days, enough that she could function, could speak, could be present in a room without being consumed by the room's interior weather. Since Grogu's arrival, the volume had dropped. Not because the transmissions had stopped. The crew of Serenity was still broadcasting at their usual intensity, Jane's low-grade suspicion and Kaylee's uncomplicated warmth and Mal's contained grief and Wash's cheerful surface tension and the deep-locked complexity of Book. All of it still present. But something about Grogu's proximity had introduced she searched for the word and found only metaphor, a harmonic. A frequency that ran underneath the noise and organized it, the way a fundamental tone organized overtones into something that could be called music instead of chaos. She had not told Simon this. She had not told Mal. She was telling Grogu now, in the language they shared, which was not words. Grogu listened with his whole small body, the way he listened to Din when Din explained things he didn't yet understand but knew were important. He felt the shape of what River was carrying. He felt the exhaustion of it, the decades of exhaustion, though she was young in years, and he felt the loneliness, which was different from Din's loneliness and different from the loneliness of the scattered Jedi survivors he had briefly known, but belonged to the same family of experience. The loneliness of a being whose nature set them apart from the people they loved most. He reached out one small hand and placed it flat against her sternum, above her heart, the way he had seen healers do in the fragmentary memories of the temple that occasionally surfaced in his dreams. River went very still. He was not healing her, he did not have that level of control, especially in his current depleted state, and what had been done to River Tam at the academy was not a wound in any sense he could directly address. But he could do something smaller and more immediate. He could show her what the Force felt like from the inside. Not the thin attenuated whisper she had been hearing her whole life, the distant signal she had never had a name for, but the actual living current of it, the vast field of connection that linked every living thing in every universe that contained living things, and which was, he wanted her to understand this, not a burden. Not a noise. Not a thing to be managed and filtered and survived. It was the truth of what everything was. It took approximately 40 seconds. When he withdrew his hand, River exhaled a breath she seemed to have been holding for years. They sat together in the quiet for a while after that. The compression coil turned in the engine room. The hull creaked its familiar creaks. Serenity moved through the black at a pace that was unhurried and steady and, for the moment, untroubled. River said, eventually, "You want to go home?" Grogu's ears moved. Assent. "You don't know how." The ears moved differently. A more complicated answer. "You think the how will present itself," River said, translating something she was reading rather than inferring. "You think you came here for a reason, and when the reason is complete the way back will be available." She paused. "That's very trusting." Grogu looked at her with the expression Din privately thought of as his ancient face. The one that surfaced occasionally and reminded you that you were talking to something 50 years old that had lived through the fall of a civilization and the deaths of nearly everyone it had known before it was old enough to form lasting memories. "I don't disagree," River said, to whatever that expression had communicated. "I've spent 2 years being moved by forces I don't control toward outcomes I couldn't predict. It's not comfortable, but it hasn't been wrong yet." She looked at her own hands for a moment. "The Alliance is going to come for you. They'll want to understand what you are. They'll want to study the Force. They'll want to understand it, and then they'll want to weaponize it, because that's what the Alliance does with things it doesn't understand. It turns them into instruments." Her voice was flat, not bitter, the flatness of someone describing weather rather than grievance. "They did it to me." Grogu's ears dropped. Not in fear, in something more like empathy. He had been, after all, the subject of exactly this kind of institutional appetite. The Empire had wanted his blood. The Force, processed and extracted and put to use in the service of power that had no right to it. He understood what River was describing at a level that was not abstract. "Your father knows," River said. Grogu looked toward the corridor that led to the crew quarters, where Din was, not sleeping, almost certainly not sleeping, in the bunk Mal had offered and that Din had accepted as a tactical position rather than a comfort, and his ears came back up. Yes. His father knew. His father had spent 1.5 years of his life in motion specifically because people who wanted what Grogu was kept finding out where Grogu was. "The man who's coming," River said. Her voice had shifted. The flatness had acquired an edge that was not quite fear. River had processed fear into something more functional, but was its close relative. "The operative. He's not like the people who've come before. He believes in what he's doing. Genuinely believes. That makes him more dangerous," Djarin said from the doorway. Neither of them had heard him approach. Grogu had known he was coming, had felt the shift in Din's presence in the Force-adjacent awareness he had of his father, the change from resting vigilance to active vigilance that meant Din had heard something or sensed something or simply reached the limit of the patience he extended to sleep when he was in an uncertain environment. But he had not signaled. He had wanted to see how River responded to being surprised. She had not flinched. Had not startled. Had turned her head toward the doorway with the calm of someone who had already known he was there. Din stepped into the common area and looked at the two of them, his son and the girl from this universe who was the nearest thing to his son's kind that this universe contained, sitting together in the low light with the particular quality of stillness that followed something significant. "How long have you been awake?" River asked him. "Since you left your bunk," Din said. He moved to the table and sat, not between them but beside, close enough to Grogu to have a hand on him in under a second if required. "You said the operative. You know him?" "I know what he is," River said. "I know the shape of his mind. I've touched it before, at distance, without meaning to." A pause. "He's coming because of the sensor report from the patrol. Your ship's entry signature was logged and transmitted and he received it. He doesn't know what you are yet. He knows you're anomalous and he knows you docked with us and he knows that anything anomalous that connects to us is his problem to solve." Her eyes met Din's across the table. "He will not stop. That's not a character flaw or an excess of zeal. It's structural. He was built to not stop." Din was quiet for a moment. In the low light of the common area his Beskar caught the ambient glow and held it, the armor's surface doing what it had always done. Presenting an unreadable surface to a universe that kept trying to read him. "Then we need to be ready before he gets here," Din said. "And we need to know what ready looks like in this situation." He looked at River. "What does he have access to?" "Ships, personnel, technology. Whatever he needs," River said simply. "He asks and it appears. He's the Alliance's solution to problems they can't solve through official channels. He has no rank because rank creates accountability and he was designed to operate without accountability." She paused. "He will come with enough force to be certain. He'll come with a polite face and a willingness to negotiate because negotiation is faster than combat and he values efficiency. And if negotiation fails he will be thorough." "How long?" Din asked. River looked at nothing for a moment, doing the calculation through whatever interior process she used for things like this. 2 days. Perhaps 3. He'll want full sensor analysis before he moves. He's careful. Din nodded once. Looked at Grogu. Grogu looked back at him with the calm attentiveness that Din had learned, over many months, to read accurately. The child was not frightened. He was present and he was thinking, in the way he thought, not linearly, not in language, but in the holistic sensing of a situation that the Force provided to those who had learned to listen to it. His ears were fully up. He had come here for a reason. He believed the reason would become clear. Djarin had not survived this long by trusting in reasons becoming clear. He had survived by preparing for the worst before the worst arrived. "I need to talk to Mal," he said. "He's awake too," River said. "He's been awake since I left my bunk." The corner of her mouth moved. "He always is, when I move through the ship at night. He thinks I don't know." "Does he know about the operative?" "He will when you tell him." She looked at Din steadily. "He needs to hear it from you. He makes better decisions about danger when it comes from someone who speaks his language." Din considered this. "What language is that?" "The language of a person who has already decided to fight," River said. "Who is looking for the right ground to fight on, not for a reason to run." She looked at Grogu, then back at Din. "You speak it fluently." Din stood, checked the corridor from reflex, and looked down at Grogu. The child had curled himself against River's knee with the ease of long familiarity, which was absurd given that they had known each other for less than a day, and was watching Din with those large calm eyes that had always seen more than they should. "Stay with her," Din said. Not a question. An acknowledgement. Grogu's ears moved in the particular way that meant yes, and also I know, and also go do what needs doing. Din walked toward the bridge, where a light was burning and a man in a brown coat was sitting in the co-pilot's seat with a cold cup of something and the expression of a man who had been waiting for a conversation he already knew was coming. Outside, in the depthless black of the Georgia system's outer reach, the stars held their positions and kept their silence, as they always did, as they always would. 2 days. Perhaps 3. Djarin had worked with less time and worse odds. He walked onto the bridge and said, "We need to talk about what's coming." Mal looked up from the viewport. Set down the cold cup. Nodded once, with the economy of a man who had been in this conversation many times before and knew exactly how it started and had never once, in all those times, chosen the easier path when the harder one was the right one. "Figured as much," Mal said. "Sit down." Mal Reynolds had a relationship with bad news that most people would have found pathological. He collected it. Sat with it. Turned it over in his hands like a man examining a weapon he hadn't decided whether to keep. Bad news, in his experience, was just the universe being honest with you, and he had developed over the years a deep and practical preference for honesty over comfort, because comfort got you dead and honesty at least gave you something to work with. So when Djarin sat down in the co-pilot's chair of his ship at the 3rd hour of the night cycle and laid out the situation with the clean economy of a man who had learned to brief tactical problems without editorializing, Mal listened without interruption and at the end of it sat for a long moment turning the information over in his hands. An Alliance operative. Inbound. 2 to 3 days. He had been in this position before. The memory of it lived in his body rather than his mind. The tension that gathered between his shoulder blades, the particular quality of stillness that preceded decisive action, the way everything peripheral fell away and left only the essential geometry of the problem. He had stood on the bridge of a ship with an operative closing in before. He knew what that felt like. He knew what it cost. He also knew, with the bone-deep certainty of a man who had paid that cost once and survived it, that the second time was different. The second time you knew exactly what you were dealing with. That was both an advantage and its own specific kind of dread. "What does he know?" Mal asked. "Your sensor report identified the Razor Crest's entry signature and hull composition as anomalous," Din said. "Transmitted automatically to Alliance intelligence channels. He knows an unregistered vessel with unknown hull composition appeared from a spatial anomaly and docked with Serenity. He doesn't know what I am or what Grogu is yet. He knows something worth investigating connected itself to your ship, and that's enough for him to move." "It's enough," Mal agreed. He looked out the viewport at the star field, which offered nothing useful but had the advantage of being something to look at while thinking. He'll have a full analysis of that sensor data inside of 12 hours if he doesn't already. Hull composition returns will go to every materials database the Alliance has access to. When nothing matches, that escalates rather than resolves. Unknown material from unknown origin docking with the ship carrying Parliament's most sensitive uncontained liability. He glanced at Din, that's how he'll frame it. Everything connects to River and Simon for him. That's his through line. River told me he won't stop. River's right. Mal said it without drama. He's not cruel for its own sake, I'll give him that much. He genuinely believes in what the Alliance is building. Believes the ends justify the methods, and he's been given sufficient means to make sure the methods work. A pause. Last time he had a cruiser and multiple gunships and a ground team that hit 3 separate settlements. He doesn't come small. Din absorbed this with the stillness of a man calculating. "What resources do you have?" Mal turned from the viewport and looked at him directly, with the expression he used when he was deciding how honest to be and had arrived at the conclusion that full honesty was the only functional option. "Serenity. 8 people, 2 of whom are non-combatants. Zoe, who is worth 3 soldiers on her worst day. Jane, who is worth 2 on his best and is frequently having his best when the shooting starts. Wash, who can fly this ship through things that have no right to be survived. Me." He paused. "And now whatever you bring." A Mandalorian and a weakened child, Din said. I watched your sensor entry on playback, Mal said. The energy signature on that arrival was, whatever you are and whatever the boy is, it registered as something this universe has never encountered. The Alliance is going to want that badly enough to bring whatever is necessary to acquire it. He leaned forward slightly. What I need to know is whether you and I want the same thing in the next 72 hours. I want Grogu safe and I want a path back to my own universe, Din said. Everything else is secondary. I want my crew alive and I want the operative to fail, Mal said. Everything else is secondary. He held Din's gaze. Those aren't incompatible. No, Din said. They aren't. The bridge was quiet for a moment with the quality of quiet that followed two people arriving at an understanding. Not warmth, neither of them were built for warmth with strangers, and they were still strangers, the events of the past several hours notwithstanding. But the functional recognition of aligned interests, which was in many ways more durable than warmth because it didn't require feeling anything, only seeing clearly. We need Zoe, Mal said, standing. And we need to do this now, before the rest of the ship wakes up and we spend 3 hours managing everyone's reactions before we can get to the planning. Zoe Washburn had been awake since River left her bunk. She had not gotten up, had not made a sound, had lain in the dark of the bunk she shared with her husband and listened to the ship with the absolute attention of someone who had learned that the sounds a ship made at night were a language worth speaking fluently. She had heard River's bare feet on the corridor plating. Had heard the slightly different footfall of a small being moving with deliberate care. Had heard, sometime later, the near-silent passage of a man in armor who moved better than any armored man she had ever encountered, and she had encountered several in the war, and they had all moved like furniture being relocated. This one moved like water. She had lain there and done her own calculations, which were similar to Mal's and reached similar conclusions, and by the time Mal appeared in the bunkroom doorway and looked at her, she was already sitting up. Operative, she said. Probably, Mal said. Conference. Bridge. Now. Zoe was dressed and moving in under 40 seconds. Wash stirred and she put a hand on his shoulder and he settled back without fully waking, with the practiced ease of a man who had learned to distinguish between the kind of leaving that required his participation and the kind that didn't. On the bridge, Din had remained in the co-pilot's seat. He turned when Zoe entered and they exchanged the specific look of two people performing a mutual tactical assessment, and both of them arrived at the same conclusion about the other simultaneously, which was that the other was not a problem. Mal pulled up the NAV display and they gathered around it. The three of them, in the low blue light of Serenity's instrumentation, with the Georgia system star field beyond the viewport and 2 days of lead time between them and whatever the operative was preparing. Options, Mal said. Give them to me. Run, Zoe said immediately. It was not a recommendation, it was an entry in an inventory. Get as much distance between us and the sensor contact point as Serenity can manage. Change our heading, avoid the patrol lanes, make for the rim. He'll track us, Din said. If he's as capable as you describe, he'll have a position track on this ship already. Running tells him we know he's coming, which tells him the anomalous vessel's occupants have been in contact with your crew and have provided intelligence. That changes his threat assessment. He comes faster and harder. Agreed, Mal said. Running is a last resort, not a first move. What else? Meet him, Din said. Zoe looked at him. Mal looked at him. The word sat in the air. Not combat, Din said. Controlled contact. You know who he is, what he wants, how he operates. He doesn't know what I am. He doesn't know what Grogu is. He has incomplete information and he's building a threat model on incomplete information. If we control when and where he gets more information, we control the threat model he builds. You want to set the terms of first contact, Zoe said. I want him to see something that makes him pause, Din said. He's coming because he thinks he knows what he's dealing with. Show him he doesn't. Something that falls entirely outside his experience of what the universe contains. Something that makes a careful man decide he needs more information before he acts. Mal was quiet for a moment, working through it. You're talking about using yourself. And the boy. I'm talking about using what we are, Din said. In my galaxy, Mandalorian armor had a specific effect on Imperial stormtroopers. Not because of what it could do, because of what it meant. What it represented. A legacy of conflict that the Empire had paid for dearly and hadn't forgotten. He paused. The operative doesn't know what Beskar is. He doesn't know what a Mandalorian is. He's never encountered the Force. If we meet him on our terms and show him the edges of what he's dealing with before he's had time to build countermeasures, we buy time. Time is what Grogu needs to recover fully. Time is what we need to find a way home. Zoe said, and if he doesn't pause? If he's too far past caution to stop for something he doesn't understand? Then we know that before he has us surrounded, Din said. And we run. Mal looked at Zoe. Zoe looked at Mal. The communication between them was the compressed, efficient kind that developed between people who had survived enough together to no longer need full sentences. It's not the worst plan I've heard, Zoe said, which from Zoe was approximately equivalent to enthusiastic endorsement. It's not the worst plan I've had, Mal agreed, which from Mal meant he was already committed to it. He turned to the NAV display and began pulling up the system's traffic patterns, the patrol lanes, the deep space waypoints that a careful man with Alliance resources would use as staging points for an approach that was thorough and controlled. They worked for 2 hours. Din contributed tactical geometry and a perspective on military operations that was different enough from Mal and Zoe's unification war experience to be genuinely useful. His frame of reference was irregular warfare, small unit operations, the specific calculus of a single combatant operating against institutional force, which mapped well enough onto the situation that the three of them found a working shorthand inside of 30 minutes. Zoe brought strategic depth and the knowledge of Alliance operational patterns that came from having fought against them at length. Mal brought the knowledge of Serenity's capabilities and limitations, the terrain of the Georgia system, and the specific improvisational architecture of a man who had built a career on making acceptable plans work in unacceptable conditions. By the time Kaylee's footsteps sounded in the corridor and the smell of reconstituted coffee began to drift from the direction of the common area, they had the skeleton of something workable. Not elegant. Not certain. But workable. Wash arrived on the bridge at the end of it, took in the NAV display, the three of them gathered around it with the specific posture of people who had been planning rather than sleeping, and said, "I'm going to need coffee and a full briefing, and I'd like them in that order, and I can tell by looking that the briefing is going to be the kind that requires the coffee to have preceded it." "Accurate," Mal said. Wash poured himself into the pilot's seat, accepted the mug Kaylee appeared with in the doorway, and looked at the NAV display with the expression of a man composing himself for bad news. "How bad?" "Operative level bad," Mal said. Wash drank half the mug in one go. "Right. Okay. Walk me through it." In the engine room, Simon Tam had arrived at first light with his medical bag and the focused expression of a doctor with a problem to solve. Grogu had woken fully and was sitting on the workbench eating from a ration pack that Kaylee had modified with several additions that Grogu found acceptable, watching Simon with the interested attention he gave to all competent people practicing their competence. Simon had never examined a patient whose species he had no reference for. He approached the problem the way he approached all problems, systematically, carefully, with the willingness to update his model as data emerged. He ran his scanner, noted the readings, revised his expectations, ran the scanner again. He checked reflexes and response times and the basic neurological indicators he could assess without species-specific baseline data. "He's recovering well," Simon said, to Din, who had appeared in the engine room doorway at the start of the examination and had not left. "Whatever the event was that depleted him, his system is handling the recovery efficiently. Nutrition, rest, and time. That's all he needs." He paused, looking at the scanner readings with an expression of someone trying not to let scientific fascination overwhelm clinical focus. The neural activity patterns are extraordinary. The regions that seem to be most active are, I don't have a framework for what they're doing. It's unlike anything in my medical database. It's the Force, Din said. You keep saying that as if I understand what it means, Simon said, not unkindly. I know, Din said. I didn't understand it either for a long time. I'm still not sure I do. He looked at Grogu, who was watching Simon with his ears fully up and his head tilted in a way that meant he found something genuinely interesting. What I know is that it keeps him alive and it keeps the people around him alive, and I've learned not to ask for more understanding than that. Simon looked at the scanner, then at Grogu, then at Din. He's going to be fully recovered within 24 hours, he said. Maybe less. Din nodded. Filed that away. 24 hours to full recovery. 2 days, perhaps 3, before the operative arrived. The margins were workable. River appeared in the engine room doorway behind Din, and Grogu turned immediately, ears up, with the bright attentiveness he showed her specifically. She looked at her brother. He's well, she said. It was not a question. She had already known. He's well, Simon confirmed, with the particular softness he reserved for his sister and almost no one else. River looked at Grogu. Something passed between them, the wordless communication they had established in the night, the shared frequency, the mutual recognition. Then she looked at Din, with the directness she had shown since the cargo bay, the eyes that saw past the armor and the stillness to whatever was underneath. He knows what's coming, she said. He's not afraid of it. I know, Din said. Are you? Din looked at his son. At the small being who had torn a hole in the fabric of reality to find the one person in an unknown universe who could hear what he was, who had crossed the void between worlds because the Force had pulled him towards something necessary, who was sitting on a workbench in the engine room of a smuggler's ship eating a modified ration pack with the serene confidence of someone who knew, at a level below thought, that things would resolve as they needed to. I'm always afraid, Din said. That's how I know what to protect. Outside Serenity's hull, the Georgia system went about its business, the slow orbital mechanics of planets and moons, the transit of merchant vessels and patrol cutters, the ordinary life of a civilization that did not yet know that something extraordinary was aboard an unremarkable mid-bulk transport moving quietly rimward in the outer belt. And 4 systems away, in a private cabin on a ship that appeared on no registry, a man in a dark coat finished reading the full materials analysis of the Razor Crest's hull composition, unknown alloy, no match in any database, molecular structure inconsistent with any known metallurgical process, and sat for a long moment with the particular stillness of a man who had just confirmed that what he was dealing with was genuinely new. He was not concerned. New things had purposes and vulnerabilities like everything else. He would find them. He began composing his operational orders. The operative ship was called the Endurance, which was not its official registry name but was what the crew called it among themselves, because it had endured things that other ships had not, and they took a quiet pride in that. It was an Alliance enforcement vessel. Not a warship in the parliamentary sense, not a vessel that appeared in public fleet records or showed up on civilian traffic displays, but something purpose-built for the work that official warships couldn't do because official warships had witnesses. It carried 24 soldiers of the specific quality that the Alliance reserved for operations it intended to succeed absolutely, a complement of short-range gunships, and 1 man who directed all of it with the calm precision of someone who had never once needed to raise his voice to make clear that his instructions were not suggestions. The operative stood at the forward observation window of the Endurance's command deck and looked at the Georgia system star, which was ordinary and yellow and entirely unremarkable, and thought about what he knew and what he didn't know and the relationship between those 2 categories. What he knew, an unregistered vessel of unknown origin had appeared from a spatial distortion event in the Georgia system's outer belt. The vessel's hull was composed of an alloy with no match in any Alliance database, any academic materials registry, any industrial catalog. The molecular structure of the alloy suggested a metallurgical sophistication beyond any known manufacturing process in the universe. The vessel had docked immediately with Serenity, which was registered to Malcolm Reynolds and was currently carrying Simon and River Tam. After docking, both vessels had moved rimward at a pace that was not panicked but was purposeful. They had not responded to the patrol's calm query, which was consistent with Reynolds' general policy of treating Alliance communication as optional. What he didn't know, the origin of the vessel, the nature of its occupants, the relationship between its occupants and Reynolds' crew, and the specific character of the spatial distortion event that had produced it. The unknown column was longer than he preferred. He had spent 24 hours addressing that imbalance. His people had run the sensor data through every analytical tool the Alliance possessed and arrived at a consistent answer, which was that the data was inconsistent with any known phenomenon. The spatial distortion did not match pulse drive failure signatures, reactor breach patterns, natural anomaly profiles, or any weapons test in the Alliance's classified database. It matched nothing. Which meant it was something new. And something new, in the operative's experience, was never simply curious. It was always, at its root, a question of power, who had it, who wanted it, and what they intended to do with it. He had also done what he always did when Reynolds was involved, he had thought about River Tam. River Tam was the Parliament's most significant unresolved problem. Not the most dangerous, not the most urgent, but the most consequential in the long term, because what she carried in her head, the accumulated intelligence she had absorbed during her time at the Academy, the names and operations and decisions that Parliament's most powerful members wanted kept in the dark, was a weapon that could not be unfired once it went off. The previous operative had failed to contain her. The operative had no intention of repeating that failure. But he had learned, from studying the previous operative's methods and errors, that direct force against River Tam produced unpredictable results, because River Tam processed threat at a speed and depth that conventional tactical planning could not account for. An unknown vessel arriving from nowhere and immediately connecting with the ship carrying River Tam was not coincidence. The operative did not believe in coincidence. He believed in causality and the importance of identifying it correctly. He turned from the window and went to the briefing room, where his senior officer, a woman named Cassius who had served with him for 3 years and had the specific quality of competence that expressed itself through silence rather than performance, was waiting with the updated position track on Serenity. "They've gone to ground in the outer belt," Cassius said, pulling up the display. "Minimal drive emissions. They're not running, they're holding. Passive sensors only from their position. They know we're coming," the operative said. "Yes, sir." "How?" Cassius was quiet for a moment. "The girl," she said. Not with contempt, with the flat acknowledgement of someone who had reviewed enough after-action reports about River Tam to have replaced contempt with respect. River Tam's documented capabilities include predictive processing based on pattern recognition. If she's had any contact with the vessel's occupants, she'll have extrapolated our response from the sensor contact event. "She'll have told Reynolds," the operative said. "Yes, sir." "So they're prepared." He looked at the position track. Serenity, holding in the outer belt. The unknown vessel presumably still docked. Reynolds prepares for things the way a man prepares for bad weather. He doesn't try to stop it. He finds the position where it damages him least and waits. He paused. What position has he chosen? Cassius pulled up the orbital mechanics display and highlighted the section of the outer belt where Serenity was holding. The Kalidasa drift zone. Irregular asteroid density, sensor interference from the mineral composition of the larger bodies, 3 viable exit vectors toward the rim. Defensible. Difficult to approach without being seen. "He wants to see us coming," the operative said. "Yes, sir." "Good." He straightened his jacket with the habitual precision that was less about vanity than about the maintenance of a certain kind of clarity, external order as an aid to internal order. "Let him see us coming. We'll approach openly. Standard formation, no aggressive posture. I want to open communication before we're within weapons range. Cassius looked at him. Sir. The unknown vessel's occupants are aboard Serenity or know what Reynolds knows, which means they know we're coming and they've had time to prepare a response, the operative said. What I don't know is whether their response is defensive or offensive, and I won't know that until I open communication. If they're defensive, if they simply want to be left alone and find a way home, wherever home is, then direct force is inefficient. If they're offensive, he paused. Then I want to know that before we're close enough for it to matter. And Reynolds? Reynolds will do what Reynolds always does, the operative said. He'll protect his people. That's a predictable constant. He moved toward the door. Begin the approach. Slow. Give them time to see us and make decisions. I want them thinking, not reacting. Reactive people make poor choices. Thinking people tell you who they are. In the Kalidas adrift zone, Serenity's sensors picked up the Endurance's approach at the outer edge of detection range, which was exactly as far out as Wash had predicted and 30 minutes earlier than Jane had bet, which meant Jane owed Wash 14 credits and was being vocal about his dissatisfaction with this outcome. 14 credits, Wash said, from the pilot's seat, with the serene satisfaction of a man who had won something small in the middle of something large and intended to enjoy it fully. You got lucky, Jane said. I got right, Wash corrected. There's a difference. They're coming in slow, Zoe said, from the co-pilot's seat, reading the sensor display with the focused attention she brought to tactical situations, which was similar to the attention she brought to everything but had a specific quality of compression to it, as if she were distilling the information down to its load-bearing elements and discarding everything else. Single vessel, standard formation. No aggressive posture. He wants to talk first, Mal said, from the doorway. Din stood beside him. That's consistent with what River described, Din said. He values efficiency. Direct force before he knows what he's dealing with is inefficient. He's also doing exactly what you said he'd do, Mal said. Trying to see us clearly before he moves. Which means we need to control what he sees, Din said. The bridge was occupied beyond its comfortable capacity. Mal, Zoe, Wash at the controls, Din standing in the doorway, and behind Din in the corridor, River, with Grogu in her arms. Grogu had been fully mobile since morning and had spent the hours since Simon's follow-up examination moving through the ship with the restored energy of a being whose recovery was genuine and complete. He had eaten 4 times. He had investigated every accessible compartment on the ship. He had spent 40 minutes in the engine room with Kaylee, who had shown him the compression coil and the catalyzer assembly and the bypass conduits with the thoroughness of someone introducing a new friend to a beloved family member, and Grogu had listened to all of it with his ears fully forward in the posture that meant he found something genuinely wonderful. Now he was watching the sensor display from River's arms with the calm attentiveness he brought to things that were about to require his participation. Incoming hail, Wash said. They're using a general broadcast frequency. Polite. Put it through, Mal said. The operative's voice filled the bridge. It was a good voice, measured, clear, without aggression or warmth, the voice of someone who had excised both as unnecessary variables. Captain Reynolds. This is a representative of the Parliamentary Special Operations Division. We're aware of the anomalous entry event in the Georgia system 48 hours ago and the subsequent docking with your vessel. We have no interest in a confrontation. We'd like to speak with the occupants of the unregistered vessel. Please respond. Mal looked at Din. Din looked at the sensor display, then at Grogu, then at Mal. He had spent the past 2 days thinking about this moment and what it required, and the conclusion he had reached was the same conclusion he reached in most tactical situations, that the best position was the honest one, stated clearly, with enough evidence of capability that the person receiving it understood the cost of disregarding it. Put me through, Din said. Mal gestured to Wash, who opened the channel. My name is Djarin, Din said. His voice was the same it always was. Level, unhurried, without performance. I'm a Mandalorian warrior from a galaxy that isn't yours. I arrived in your system by accident. I intend to leave as soon as I'm able. I have a child with me. He isn't a weapon and he isn't a resource and he isn't available for study or acquisition. A pause, calibrated. I've been in enough conflicts to know that the next thing you say will tell me whether we're going to have a problem. The channel was quiet for a moment. Then the operative said, a Mandalorian. That's not a term in any database I have access to, Mr. Djarin. No, Din agreed. It wouldn't be. You said a galaxy that isn't ours. Yes. Another pause, longer. The operative was processing. Din could feel it in the quality of the silence, the working silence of a careful mind encountering a variable it hadn't anticipated and revising its model rather than discarding the information. The spatial distortion event was a transit between universes, the operative said. It was not quite a question. Yes, Din said. And the child caused it. Din said nothing. Which was its own answer. I see, the operative said. And the quality of those two words. The specific density of them, the way they landed in the bridge's silence, told Din that the man saying them did indeed see, and that what he saw had not made him less interested. Mal put a hand on Din's arm, briefly, not restraining, just marking the moment. Then he leaned toward the comm. Here's how this works, Mal said, with the conversational directness he used when he had decided how a situation was going to go and was informing the other party. You've got a ship that came from somewhere your verse doesn't contain. You've got a child who can do things your science can't explain. You've got a Mandalorian warrior standing between you and both of those things, and from what I understand of Mandalorians in the past 12 hours, that is a significant obstacle. He paused. You can come in hard and find out the full cost of that. Or you can be the careful man River tells me you are and recognize that some things are above your pay grade. Very little is above my pay grade, Captain Reynolds, the operative said. That's what the last one thought, Mal said. The channel went quiet. Din watched the sensor display. The Endurance had not changed its approach vector. Slow, steady, unhurried. The gunships in its complement were showing on the display now, two of them, flanking the main vessel at a distance that was tactical without being overtly aggressive. He's thinking, River said quietly, from the corridor. How long does he think? Din asked. Until he has enough, she said. He'll want to see you. In person or as close to it as this situation allows. He needs to assess what he's dealing with in a way that sensor data doesn't provide. He wants a meeting, Zoe said. He'll ask for one, River said. He'll frame it as information exchange. He'll present it as the efficient path. She paused. He's not wrong that it's the efficient path. He's just wrong about what information he'll get from it. Din looked at Grogu. Grogu had been watching the sensor display with the patient, total attention he brought to things he considered important, and now he turned and looked at Din, and something passed between them in the wordless language they had developed across months of shared experience, the language of a father and son who had learned each other in the absence of common vocabulary. Grogu's ears were fully up. He was not afraid. He was ready. The comm crackled. Mr. Djarin, the operative said. I'd like to propose a face-to-face conversation. Neutral ground, the open cargo bay of your host vessel, visible to both ship's sensors. No weapons drawn, no troops deployed. Just a conversation between people who have incomplete information about each other. A pause. I think you'll find I'm a reasonable man. I've met reasonable men, Din said. Some of them were. Then you know how to recognize one, the operative said. 2 hours. I'll come to you. Din closed the channel and stood for a moment in the bridge's quiet, feeling the weight of the decision the way he felt all decisions, not with hesitation but with the full attention of someone who understood that decisions had consequences and consequences compounded. He looked at Mal. Your ship, Din said. Your call. Mal looked at him for a long moment, the measuring look of a man checking the math one more time before committing. Then he looked at Zoe. Zoe said. We've been in worse positions. We have, Mal agreed. He looked at Din, tell him yes. And then you and I are going to spend the next 2 hours making sure that whatever he sees when he comes aboard this ship is exactly what we want him to see. Din opened the channel. 2 hours, he said. Come alone. Of course, the operative said, with the equanimity of a man who had never needed anyone else to be the most dangerous thing in a room. The channel closed. The Endurance continued its slow approach through the Kalidas adrift zone, unhurried and certain, the way powerful things moved when they were not yet sure of the resistance but were confident of the outcome. In River's arms, Grogu watched the sensor display and said nothing and thought whatever a 50-year-old Force-sensitive being thought when a confrontation that the Force had pulled him across the boundary of universes to reach was finally, measurably, 2 hours away. His ears did not drop once. The cargo bay of Serenity had hosted many things in its working life: contraband, livestock, refugees, the occasional body, the ongoing low-level chaos of a crew that treated shared space as an extension of their individual personalities. It had been a battlefield and a sanctuary and a dining room and a repair shop, sometimes in the same week. It was not, by any reasonable measure, a diplomatic venue. Mal had done what he could with it. The crates had been redistributed to create a central open space. The lighting, Serenity's lighting, was always slightly inadequate, a consequence of the ongoing negotiation between power consumption and visibility that characterized life on an aging vessel, had been adjusted to its maximum output, which was honest rather than flattering. 2 chairs had been placed in the center, facing each other across 4 feet of deck plating. Nothing else. Mal had considered and rejected the idea of a table. A table suggested negotiation. What he wanted to suggest was assessment. He stood to one side of the bay with Zoe, both of them in the posture of people who were armed and aware of it without being threatening about it, and watched the docking collar complete its seal with the operative shuttle. Din stood at the other side of the bay, Grogu in the crook of his left arm, Beskar catching the cargo bay's honest light and returning it unchanged. He had spent the 2 hours of preparation time in a silence that Mal had come to understand was not absence but concentration, the gathering of a man who fought best from stillness. He had not adjusted his armor or his weapons. He had not made any concession to the diplomatic character of the meeting in his presentation, and Mal had not suggested he should. The armor was the message. The child was the message. The stillness was the message. River was not in the cargo bay. She was 2 bulkheads forward, in the common area, and she had asked to be there specifically, and when Mal had started to object she had looked at him with the expression that meant she had already seen how the conversation ended and was saving them both time. She was there because the operative's ability to read people was exceptional and her ability to read him was better, and she could monitor the encounter from a distance that didn't expose her to him directly while still providing real-time intelligence to Mal through the ship's internal comm. Jane was on the catwalk above the cargo bay with a rifle that he had named Vera and with which he had what Mal privately considered an inappropriate emotional relationship. His instructions were to hold position, hold fire, and under no circumstances do anything that could be interpreted as aggressive. Jane had agreed to this with the specific quality of reluctant compliance that meant he understood the tactical logic and reserved the right to be dissatisfied with it. The docking collar opened. The operative stepped through. He was not what Mal had expected, the first time. He still, on some level, wasn't. There was nothing about the man's presentation that announced danger: medium height, dark coat, a face that was composed and unremarkable in the way of someone who had made a deliberate practice of being underestimated. He moved into the cargo bay with the ease of someone entering a room he had already mapped from the outside, which he had, and stopped at the edge of the open space and looked at everything with the patient completeness of a scanner taking readings. His eyes went to Mal, to Zoe, to Jane on the catwalk, a flicker of acknowledgement, catalogued and filed, and then to Din. He held there for 3 seconds. Then his eyes went to Grogu. And something happened that Mal had not anticipated and that he suspected the operative had not anticipated either. The operative went very still. Not the performative stillness of a man controlling his reactions, which was his default mode and which Mal had learned to read accurately. Something different. The stillness of a man encountering something that did not fit any category his experience had prepared him for, and taking a genuine moment to process it. Grogu was watching him back with the calm, total attention he gave to all new things. His ears were fully up. He was not afraid. He was, if Mal was reading him correctly after 3 days of acquaintance, curious. "Mr. Djarin," the operative said, returning his gaze to Din, "you're exactly what your voice suggested." "And you're exactly what I was told," Din said. The operative moved to one of the chairs and sat with the unhurried ease of someone entirely comfortable in an uncomfortable situation. Din didn't sit. He remained standing, Grogu against his chest, and the operative looked at this and made no comment about it, which was itself a comment. "I want to understand what I'm looking at," the operative said. "Not as a precursor to action. As a genuine statement of intent. I find it difficult to make good decisions with incomplete information." "Then we have something in common," Din said. "The child caused the transit event," the operative said. Not a question. He had already reached this conclusion and was using the statement as an opening, a way of establishing that he had done his analytical work and was not starting from ignorance. "Yes," Din said. "Through what mechanism?" "The Force," Din said. "An energy field that connects all living things. In my galaxy it's been known and studied for thousands of years. Some individuals can interact with it directly. He's one of them." The operative looked at Grogu with renewed attention. "And in this universe?" "It exists here," Din said. "Differently. Quietly. But it's present." The operative was silent for a moment. His eyes moved to Mal, then back to Din. "River Tam," he said. The name landed in the cargo bay like a stone dropped into water. Mal felt Zoe's stillness change beside him, not movement, just a different quality of readiness. "I know she's aboard," the operative continued, with the measured calm of someone defusing the charge in a statement before it could detonate. "I'm not here for her today. I want to be clear about that. What I'm here for is a genuine assessment of what entered this system 48 hours ago and what its implications are." He paused. "But the child's ability and River Tam's documented capabilities appear to be related phenomena. That's a connection I'd be negligent not to note." "Note it," Din said. "And then understand that whatever connection exists between them is not a resource. It's not something you get to study or acquire or develop into an instrument. It's two beings recognizing something they share. That's all it is and that's all it will be." "You say that with considerable certainty," the operative said. "I say it with the certainty of a man who's fought the same battle before," Din said. "In my galaxy, an empire decided what the child is was a resource. They spent years trying to acquire it. They failed because I didn't let them succeed, and every single one of them that got between me and the child found out what that cost." He held the operative's gaze with the complete, unblinking steadiness that was not aggression but was its close relative. "I'm not in my galaxy anymore. But I'm the same man." The cargo bay was very quiet. The operative looked at Din for a long time. He was doing what River had said he would do, reading him, building a model, testing the model against everything he could observe. Mal watched the process with the attention of someone who had been read by this man before and had not enjoyed the experience. Then the operative said, "Show me." Din looked at him. "The Force," the operative said. "Show me what it looks like. Not as a demonstration of threat, I'm not asking you to perform. I'm asking because I need to understand the nature of what I'm dealing with, and a description is not sufficient." He looked at Grogu, and there was something in his expression that was, Mal thought, as close to genuine curiosity as this man was capable of showing, which was not nothing, just compressed. I've spent my career identifying things that threaten the stability of what we're building. Understanding is how I do that accurately. Show me what he is. Din looked at Grogu. Grogu had been listening to the entire exchange with his full attention, turning his head between the speakers with the tracking precision of a creature following meaning rather than just sound. When Din looked at him, he looked back. Another of those exchanges that needed no words because they had long since built a language out of other things. The angle of Grogu's ears, the quality of Din's stillness, the shared history of 1,000 situations navigated together. Then Grogu turned to look at the operative. He studied the man for a moment. Long enough that the operative, who was not a man easily made uncertain, shifted very slightly in his chair, not a flinch, something subtler, the involuntary response of someone being seen more completely than they were accustomed to. Then Grogu raised one small hand and reached into the thin current of the force that ran through Serenity's hull and the Kalidasa drift zone and the entire Georgia system and beyond, and he did something simple. Something that required almost no effort from a being who was now fully recovered and operating at the complete depth of his ability. He found every loose object in the cargo bay. 3 bolts on the edge of a crate, a hydrospanner Kaylee had left on a shelf, a length of cable coiled near the bulkhead, a data PADD that Mal had been looking for since yesterday, and he lifted them. All of them, simultaneously, smoothly, without strain, and held them in the air at exactly the same height in a slow rotation around the central space, the way the compression coil turned in the engine room, steady, unhurried, patient. The operative did not move. The objects turned. Then Grogu set them down, one by one, gently, in positions that were better organized than they had been before. The hydrospanner back on its proper shelf. The cable coiled tighter. The bolts in a neat row. The PADD placed directly in front of Mao, who looked at it and then at Grogu and felt something that was difficult to name but was in the neighborhood of gratitude. In the silence that followed, the operative sat very still. That was restrained, Din said. He could do considerably more. I can see that, the operative said quietly. In my galaxy, there were warriors who had trained in the Force for decades, Din said. Who could stop blaster bolts in the air? Pull starships off course. Bring down structures. The child is young and his training was interrupted. He'll be stronger when it's complete. He paused. And I'll be beside him when it is. That's a permanent fact about the universe, wherever the universe happens to be. The operative looked at Grogu for a long time. Grogu looked back with his ears fully up and his expression carrying the quality that Din thought of as his ancient face. The one that surfaced when something recognized something else across a great distance of experience. Then Grogu did something unexpected. He reached toward the operative with one small hand, palm up. Not a forced gesture. The simple human-adjacent reach of a small creature extending an offer. The operative looked at the hand. Something moved across his face that was not in his repertoire of controlled expressions, something that surfaced from a depth the control didn't quite reach. It was there for less than 2 seconds and then it was gone, managed back below the surface with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned young that visible feeling was a liability. But River had been watching from 2 bulkheads forward. And later she would tell Mao, in the quiet of the common area after the operative had returned to his shuttle and the docking collar had sealed behind him, that in those 2 seconds she had felt something from him that she had not expected and that had changed the architecture of her understanding of the situation. She had felt recognition. Not of Grogu specifically. Of what Grogu represented, the thing the operative had been before he had been made into what he was. The child's simple, uncomplicated reach had been, for 2 seconds, a mirror, and the man in the dark coat had looked into it and seen someone he had not thought about in a very long time. In the cargo bay, the operative lowered his eyes from Grogu's outstretched hand and looked at Din. You said you need to go home, he said. Yes, Din said. And the child's recovery is complete? Yes. The operative was quiet for a long moment. Then. The transit event left a residual spatial distortion signature in the outer belt. My science division has been analyzing it since we detected your arrival. The distortion has a directional component. It points, for lack of a better term, back toward its origin. Like a trail. He paused. I could share that analysis with you. The coordinates of the highest intensity residual point in the distortion field. Whether the child can use that information to open a return transit. He paused again, and what moved across his face this time was more legible, because he allowed it to be. That would be between him and whatever it is that allows him to do what he does. Mal stared at him. Zoe's stillness had changed quality again, the specific shift of someone recalculating a situation from its foundations. On the catwalk, Jane lowered his rifle approximately 2 inches, which for Jane was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Din looked at the operative for a long time. The same measured, unblinking assessment he applied to all things. Reading the man the way the man had been reading him. Why? Din said. The operative looked at Grogu, who had lowered his hand but was still watching the man in the dark coat with the total attention he gave to things that were not finished yet. Because some things, the operative said carefully, are above my pay grade. He looked at Din, and because a child who crosses universes looking for the one person who can hear what he is, he stopped. Finished the sentence in silence, in the private language of a man who had buried the part of himself that understood such things a long time ago and was briefly, unexpectedly, in contact with it again. He stood, straightened his jacket with the habitual precision, and looked at Mal, Captain Reynolds. I'll transmit the distortion analysis to your ship within the hour. What you do with it is your business. He paused. I'd suggest doing it quickly. My report to Parliament will be filed within 24 hours. After that, what I recommend and what is decided are 2 different things. He walked back toward the docking collar with the same measured ease with which he had entered. At the collar's edge he stopped, without turning. Mr. Djarin, he said. In your galaxy. The empire that wanted the child. A pause. Did it fall? Din said, yes. The operative stood there for a moment with his back to the cargo bay and said nothing. Then he stepped through the collar and was gone. The seal completed. The docking umbilical retracted. On the sensor display, his shuttle separated from Serenity's hull and moved back toward the Endurance in the slow, unhurried arc of something that had accomplished what it came to do. The cargo bay was completely silent. Then Grogu made a sound, small, satisfied, the sound he made when something had resolved the way the Force had indicated it would. And reached up to pat Din's chest plate twice with one small hand, the way he did when he wanted Din to know that he had known how it would go and was not surprised, and Din could relax now. Mal looked at the docking collar, then at the sensor display, then at Din. Well, he said, in the tone of a man updating his understanding of the universe's capacity for surprise. That's not how I thought that was going to go. No, Din agreed. River's going to be insufferable about having been right, Zoe said. River's always right, Wash said over the internal comm from the bridge, cheerfully. We've had years to make peace with that. Mr. Djarin, welcome to the club. The membership benefits are limited but the company is excellent. Grogu's ears were fully up. Outside the hull, in the Kalidasa drift zone, the Endurance turned slowly on its axis and began its departure vector. The 2 gunships fell into formation alongside it. The asteroid field's mineral-dense bodies caught the Georgia system's yellow star and threw back cold light in every direction, indifferent and ancient, as they had been doing long before anyone had built ships to move among them and would be doing long after the last ship was gone. The operative's data transmission arrived 17 minutes later. Clean, complete, without condition or commentary. Just coordinates and a distortion analysis that Din studied with the focused attention he brought to navigation problems, and that Grogu studied with something that was not attention in the conventional sense but was more complete. Grogu looked at the coordinates for a long time. His ears moved in the way that meant yes. And also, I know this shape. And also, underneath both of those, it's time. The preparation took 4 hours, which was 3 hours and 50 minutes longer than Din would have preferred and approximately right for everything that needed to happen before they could attempt a transit that had no guarantee of success and no margin for error. The Razor Crest was detached from Serenity's docking collar and repositioned 2 kilometers off the transport's port bow, which was the distance Din had calculated as sufficient to prevent the transit event from affecting Serenity's hull integrity if the energy release was comparable to the arrival. The arrival had been violent in ways he hadn't fully understood until he reviewed the Crest's black box recording in the hours after. The portal had generated a shockwave that would have torn apart any vessel within 500 meters. 2 kilometers was conservative. He preferred conservative. He spent the first hour going through the Crest systems with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had learned that overlooked details and pre-flight checks expressed themselves at the worst possible moments. The hull was sound. Beskar-reinforced sections had taken the transit without structural compromise, and the standard alloy portions had stress fractures in 2 locations that he patched with the Crest's repair kit and would address properly when they were home. The drive was functional. The weapons systems were operational. The navigation computer was still returning no matches on the local star charts and probably always would, but that was about to become irrelevant. He loaded the operative's distortion analysis into the NAV system and spent 40 minutes studying it with the patient attention of someone translating a language they didn't speak but could recognize the grammar of. The analysis was thorough. Alliance science was not what he was accustomed to, but it was not primitive, and the people who had run the analysis had done careful work. The residual distortion field had a directionality that the operative had described accurately. It pointed, like a compass needle, back toward the origin point of the transit. The highest intensity residual was a coordinate in the outer belt approximately 12 kilometers from their current position. That was where the fabric between universes was thinnest. That was where Grogu would need to reach. Whether reaching would work, whether a transit could be deliberately initiated rather than accidentally triggered, whether the crossing could be reversed rather than simply repeated in a new direction, Din did not know. He had asked River, who had sat with Grogu for an hour in the common area in the wordless communication they had developed, and then returned to the corridor outside the engine room where Din was working and said, "He thinks so. He's never done it deliberately. But he understands the shape of it now in a way he didn't before. The first time he was reaching toward something. This time he knows where the door is." Din had filed that under workable and continued his preparation. The second hour was fuel. The Crest's reserves had been drawn down during the holding period in the Kalidasa drift zone. Minimal drive emissions meant minimal consumption, but minimal was not zero, and the calculation he had run on arrival had given him 4 weeks of fuel, and some of those weeks were now spent. He had enough. Not comfortably enough. Enough. Kaylee had appeared at the Crest's boarding hatch during the second hour with a toolkit and an expression of professional interest that Din had recognized as the same expression she wore when Serenity needed attention, the focused, unself-conscious engagement of someone for whom mechanical systems were not a job but a conversation. She had asked, with the directness that characterized everything about her, if she could look at the drive systems. He had considered this for approximately 4 seconds and then said yes, because the fuel calculation was marginal and Kaylee knew pulse drive architecture at a molecular level, and while the Crest's drive was not pulse drive, the underlying thermodynamic principles had enough in common that her assessment might find something useful. She had found something useful. A power coupling in the secondary drive manifold that had been stressed by the transit and was operating at 70% efficiency without having thrown any error codes, because the Crest's diagnostic system was calibrated for standard performance parameters, and 70% of the Crest's drive was still well above what the diagnostic system considered a reportable anomaly. Kaylee had replaced the coupling from the Crest's own spares inventory, talking to the drive the entire time in the low, continuous murmur she apparently used as a working method, and the manifold's efficiency had returned to 94%. It would not get them all the way to 100, the coupling replacement was a field repair and field repairs were honest about their limitations. But 94% changed the fuel calculation from marginal to comfortable, and comfortable was what Din needed it to be. He had thanked her. She had waved the thanks away with the ease of someone to whom the work was its own reward and left the crest with grease on her forearms and the satisfied expression of someone who had done a thing well. The third hour was the one Din had been holding at the edge of his attention since the conversation in the cargo bay with the operative, because it was the hour that required him to return to Serenity and stand in the common area and acknowledge that 4 days of proximity had produced something he had not anticipated and was not certain he knew how to handle correctly. He had sat with the crew of Serenity across 3 meals and 1 crisis and 2 nights of partial sleep and the specific sustained pressure of a situation that required everyone present to be fully themselves, because there was no time or energy for performance. He had watched Reynolds make decisions the way Din made decisions. From the inside out, from principle rather than calculation, paying the cost of those decisions without complaint because complaint changed nothing and the decision still needed to be made. He had watched Zoe operate with a competence so complete it was nearly invisible, the way the best things always were. He had watched Wash fly Serenity through the Kalidasa drift zone's irregular asteroid density with the loose wrist ease of someone for whom danger in a cockpit was simply the medium in which excellence expressed itself. He had watched Kaylee love the ship the way he had learned to love the crest, not sentimentally but practically, with the love that expressed itself through maintenance and attention and the refusal to let something worth preserving fall into disrepair. He had watched books sit at the edge of things and listen with the quality of attention that some people spent their whole lives learning and most never fully achieved. He had watched River Tam give his son something he could not give him. That was the thing he had been holding at the edge of his attention. That was the thing he needed to stand in the common area and acknowledge before he took Grogu back to a galaxy where the Force was wide and deep and present everywhere but where the people who could hear it were scattered and few and most of them were still learning what it meant to have survived the thing that had almost killed it entirely. He came back through the docking collar for the last time and found the crew assembled in the common area with the unconscious communal instinct of people who had understood without being told that this was a leaving and leaving's required presence. Mal at the head of the table. Zoe beside him. Wash with his arm around Zoe's shoulders and his usual deflecting humor absent in a way that made him look more fully himself. Kaylee on the bench with her hands wrapped around a mug and her eyes bright with the particular brightness of someone fighting a feeling they had decided to feel anyway. Jane at the end of the table with his arms crossed and an expression of studied indifference that fooled no one. Book in his chair at the edge of things, hands folded, present in the complete way he was always present. River stood apart, near the corridor, with Grogu in her arms. Grogu had been with her for the past hour. Din had known where he was and had left him there, because the past hour was time they needed together and Grogu had understood that and Din had understood it and neither of them had needed to say so. Din stood at the edge of the common area and looked at the crew of Serenity and found that he did not have a prepared statement, which was unusual for him. He generally knew what needed to be said and said it without preamble. But the thing that needed to be said here was not a tactical briefing or a statement of terms or a declaration of intent. It was something quieter and more difficult. Mal solved the problem for him, the way capable people sometimes did, by saying the essential thing before Din had to find the words for it. "You'd have fit in here," Mal said. It was not a compliment exactly. It was an assessment, delivered with the directness he applied to assessments. The verse could use someone like you. Someone who holds a line. Your verse has people who hold lines, Din said. He looked at Zoe when he said it, and then at Mal, and the acknowledgement in his expression covered everyone at the table without being performed at any of them. It does, Mal agreed. But there's always room for one more. Kaylee made a sound that was definitely not a word. You've been outrageously dangerous to have aboard and I'd do it again, Wash said, from under Zoe's arm. That is my complete and honest assessment of the situation and I stand by it. Jane uncrossed and recrossed his arms. Your armor's good, he said, which from Jane was a formal declaration of respect and everyone at the table understood it as such. Book looked at Din across the room with the expression of the locked door slightly opened. The Force, he said. In all things. Whatever it's called. He paused. I think I've always known it was there. I simply didn't have the right word for it. Din looked at him for a moment. None of us do, he said. That's the point, I think. He moved to River. She was holding Grogu with the ease of someone who had been holding him for an hour and had found the right way to do it, his weight distributed correctly, his back supported, his sight lines unobstructed so he could watch everything. Grogu was watching Din approach with his ears fully up and his expression entirely calm. The ancient face and the child face simultaneously present the way they sometimes were when something was both an ending and not an ending. Din stopped in front of River and looked at her and found that this was the hardest part. Not because he was afraid of what she was or uncertain about the decision to leave, but because he understood, in the complete way he had come to understand things about Grogu that couldn't be put into language, what the past 4 days had meant for the child. What it had meant to be heard. What it had meant to not be alone in it. He'll find others, Din said. His voice was level. The effort of keeping it level was his own business. I know, River said. She looked at Grogu, who was looking at her, and they were doing the thing again. The wordless exchange, the shared frequency, the mutual recognition that had brought them across the boundary between universes in the first place. I told him. He knows. And you? Din said. River looked at him. Her dark eyes were clear and direct and carrying the 50,000 things she was always carrying, but on the surface of all of them was something new. The specific quality of a person who has been given something they didn't know they were missing and is now in the process of understanding how to carry it forward. I'm better than I was, she said. The harmonic he showed me, the way the current runs underneath everything, she paused, searching for the right word and not quite finding it, settling for the nearest one. It doesn't go away when he leaves. It was always there. He just taught me how to hear it. Din nodded once. Then he reached out and took Grogu from her arms. Grogu went to him with the ease of long habit, settling against the left side of his chest plate in the position he had occupied for so many thousands of hours that the Beskar had worn very slightly in that precise location, a record of contact pressed into the hardest material in the galaxy. He curled one hand into the edge of Din's pauldron and looked back at River over Din's shoulder. River raised one hand. Not a wave. A gesture that was quieter than a wave and more specific, the hand held palm out, steady, the gesture of someone marking a moment they intended to keep. Grogu's ears were fully up. Din turned and walked toward the docking collar without looking back, because looking back was not something he did and not something this moment required. He could feel the crew of Serenity behind him in the way he had learned to feel the people Grogu cared about, their presence registering in the edge of his awareness like warmth registering on a thermal sensor, undeniable and real. At the collar's threshold he stopped. He didn't turn. But he said, to the room at his back and everyone in it, this is the way. He heard Mal's voice, quiet and without performance, as he stepped through, take care of each other. The Razor Crest settled at the coordinates the operative had provided, 12 kilometers into the outer belt, with Serenity holding at 2 kilometers distance on the sensor display. The asteroid field's ancient bodies drifted around them in the slow orbital ballet that had been proceeding since before any civilization in this universe had learned to look up and wonder what the lights were. Din ran the pre-transit checklist from memory. Every system confirmed operational. Grogu was in the co-pilot's cradle, strapped in with the harness Din had modified 3 times to fit correctly, sitting with his hands flat on his knees and his eyes closed and his entire small body carrying the quality of inward attention that preceded significant force work. Din watched him for a moment. You ready? He said. Grogu didn't open his eyes. His ears moved in the way that meant yes and also I've been ready and also stop asking. Din almost smiled. He faced forward instead, hands on the controls, because if this worked he would need to fly the crest through whatever the portal opened into, and if it didn't work he would need to fly the crest away from whatever the failure produced, and either way his hands needed to be on the controls. Serenity, this is the Razor Crest, he said into the comm, stand by. Mal's voice came back immediately. Standing by. And for the record, it was good flying with you, Djarin. Din looked at the star field. The Georgia system's yellow sun painted everything in the pale amber of a universe that was not his and had never been his but had, for 4 days, been what was available, and he had worked with what was available and found it more than sufficient. Likewise, Reynolds, he said. He closed the comm channel. In the co-pilot's cradle, Grogu reached into the Force. This time it was different from the first time. Not the instinctive, overwhelming reach of a being pulled towards something unknown, but the deliberate, concentrated extension of a child who had learned something about himself in the past 4 days that he hadn't known before. He knew the shape of the door now. He had stood at its threshold from the other side and understood how it was built and where its edges were and what it required to open it from this direction. The force in this universe was thin but it was real, and Grogu gathered all of it he could reach, the current running through Serenity's hull 2 kilometers distant, through the mineral-dense asteroids of the Kalidasa drift zone, through the ancient unobserved life of deep space that existed everywhere if you knew how to listen for it. And he added to it the vast deep reservoir of the Force as he had always known it, the connection to his own galaxy that had not broken when he crossed the boundary but had stretched, attenuated, a thread rather than a current, still present, still real. He pulled both together. The space 12 meters ahead of the Razor Crest's bow began to change. It was not violent this time. It was controlled and deliberate, and it built slowly, the way a skilled thing always built. With intention rather than desperation. The distortion field that the operative's analysts had mapped as a directional residue began to activate, responding to the concentrated force energy Grogu was channeling through it the way a lock responded to the right key. The fabric of the space between universes, which was thin at this coordinate precisely because this was where it had been torn before, began to part along its own prior scar. Light appeared. Not the nameless color of the arrival. Something more familiar. Something that looked, through the forming portal, almost like the light of a distant star that Din's navigation system would know. His sensors stuttered. Then returned a reading. 1 star chart match. Partial. Expanding as the portal widened. He looked at it. Looked at the coordinates. Looked at the portal, which was now wide enough for the crest to pass through and was holding steady with the controlled precision of something managed rather than erupted. He looked at Grogu. Grogu's eyes were open now, fixed on the portal, his small face carrying the effort of sustained concentration, not anguished, not desperate, but fully inhabited, every resource directed toward the single task of holding the door open long enough. "Good," Din said. Quietly. The word that covered everything. "That's good, kid." He pushed the throttle forward. The Razor Crest crossed the threshold between universes at half impulse, smooth and controlled, the way Djarin did most things, without ceremony, without hesitation, with total commitment to the decision already made. Behind them, through the narrowing portal, the Georgia system's amber light contracted to a point. Then it was gone. The star charts came back all at once. Not the slow, incremental return of a system rebooting from damage, a sudden complete reinstatement, every catalog entry snapping into alignment with the stars visible through the viewport as if they had never been absent. The navigation computer processed the transition in 4.3 seconds and then displayed, with the flat equanimity of a machine that did not understand the magnitude of what it was reporting, a position fix. Coordinates. A location in space that Djarin knew. The Outer Rim. The Mandalore system's neighboring sectors, sparse and quiet, the kind of deep space that existed between things rather than at them. No Imperial remnant presence on the sensors. No New Republic patrol vessels within detection range. No traffic of any kind for approximately 40 light minutes in every direction except one. A distant freighter running a standard cargo lane, broadcasting its registry with the unconcerned openness of a vessel that had nothing to hide and nowhere urgent to be. Din sat with the position fix for a long moment and did not move. Grogu was asleep. He had lost consciousness approximately 8 seconds after the Razor Crest cleared the portal, which had collapsed behind them with a sound that the hull's audio sensors had recorded as a resonant deep-frequency pulse and that Din had felt through the deck plating as a vibration that lasted 3 seconds and then was simply gone. The force work of opening a deliberate transit between universes had cost Grogu everything he had recovered over 4 days, which was everything the first crossing had cost him, which meant they were back at the beginning in terms of the child's capacity, depleted, sleeping deeply, needing time and food and rest before anything else. Din unstrapped his harness, moved to the co-pilot's cradle, and checked Grogu's breathing and pulse with the practiced competence of someone who had done this many times and whose hands knew what normal felt like without needing instruction from his conscious mind. Breathing slow and deep. Pulse steady. Temperature normal. The same readings as the first time. The same profound depletion that looked, to anyone who didn't know, alarming, and that Din had learned to read accurately as the body doing exactly what it needed to do. He pulled the small blanket from the storage compartment behind the cradle, the one that had been there since the early days, worn soft from use, that Grogu had claimed by proximity and repetition, and tucked it around the child without waking him. Then he returned to the pilot's seat and sat for a while in the quiet. The outer rim held its silence around the crest in the way it always had, the vast indifferent patience of deep space, which did not care about the things that happened within it and did not record them and would continue its existence in precisely the same manner regardless of what any vessel moving through it had been through. Din had always found this comforting rather than bleak. The universe's indifference was not cruelty. It was the foundation on which everything else was built. It didn't require anything from you. What you did within it was entirely your own. He thought about a cargo bay in a universe that was not his, and a man in a dark coat who had made a decision that Din had not expected and still did not entirely understand. He turned it over in his mind the way he turned tactical situations over, looking for the load-bearing element, the thing that explained everything else. River had told him, in the brief exchange they'd had after the operative shuttle departed, that she had felt something from the man in those 2 seconds when Grogu extended his hand. Recognition. The child had held up a mirror and the man had seen something he had buried, and the buried thing had influenced a decision that the operational logic of his position would not have produced on its own. Din had spent enough time thinking about buried things to understand the mechanism. He had been, for years, a man defined entirely by his armor and his creed and the particular compressed existence of someone who had learned to need very little because needing things was a vulnerability and vulnerabilities got you killed. Grogu had not changed that. Grogu had added something to it. Had shown him that the armor and the creed and the compressed existence could coexist with something warmer and more complicated, that you could hold a line and hold a child simultaneously and neither would diminish the other. The operative had seen that for 2 seconds. Din did not know what the man would do with what he had seen. Did not know whether it would change him in ways that lasted or whether the institutional weight of what he was and what he served would simply reassert itself, the way institutional weight always tried to. He hoped, with the specific quality of hope that he applied to things outside his control, spare, unsentimental, a single clean wish without expectation attached, that it would change something. That River and Simon Tam would benefit from whatever shift had occurred in that cargo bay. He would never know. He accepted this the way he accepted all the things he would never know about the people who had moved through his life and then out of it. The Armorer. Grief Karga. Cara Dune. Peli Motto. Bo-Katan Kryze, who was doing the work of rebuilding something that deserved to be rebuilt. Luke Skywalker, who had taken Grogu's training and given it back to the galaxy that had tried to extinguish it. All of them out there. All of them doing what they did. All of them part of the same vast connected field that ran underneath everything. Din keyed the navigation system and plotted a course. Not urgent, Grogu needed recovery time and the immediate environment was clear, but purposeful. They needed a destination. They needed food for the child, which meant a settlement, which meant people, which meant the ordinary ongoing business of existence in a galaxy that had its own complications entirely separate from the complications of universes he had accidentally visited. He set a course for a station he knew in the midrim. 3 days at standard cruise. Fuel comfortable. Systems nominal. The stress fractures in the hull plating noted and scheduled for proper repair when they arrived. He flew. On the second day, Grogu woke. He came to consciousness the same way he had in Serenity's engine room, the slow, deliberate surfacing, the eyes opening in the dimness of the Crest's cockpit, the immediate sensory inventory that Din had watched him perform hundreds of times. The star field through the viewport. The familiar vibration of the Crest's drive, different from Serenity's compression coil but his own, known, reliable. The smell of the cockpit, which was the smell of the ship they lived in and therefore the smell of home. He looked at Din. Din looked at him. "Welcome back," Din said. Grogu's ears came up fully. He looked around the cockpit with the attentiveness of someone confirming a location, and something in his expression settled when the star charts and the sensor readouts and the particular quality of the darkness outside confirmed what the Force had already told him. He was home. The thinness was gone. The Force was wide and deep around him again, the full current of it, the vast field connecting every living thing in a galaxy that had come close to forgetting it existed and was slowly, imperfectly, incompletely remembering. He made a sound. The hungry sound. Which was entirely correct and exactly what Din had been waiting for. "I know," Din said, and reached for the ration storage. He heated something. Set it in front of Grogu, who ate with the focused efficiency of a being whose body had been doing serious work and required fuel without delay. Din watched him eat and felt the thing he always felt watching Grogu do: ordinary things after extraordinary events, a relief so complete it wasn't quite a feeling anymore, just a condition, the background state of a man whose most important concern was accounted for and present and consuming a meal. When Grogu finished eating he sat for a moment and looked at his hands. Then he looked at Din with the expression that meant he had something to communicate and was working on how. Din waited. He had learned to wait. Grogu raised one hand, palm up, the way he had held it out to the operative in the cargo bay of Serenity. He held it there for a moment, not offering it to Din, not reaching toward anything. Just displaying the gesture. Showing Din what he had done. Then he closed his hand slowly, looked at his closed fist, and opened it again. "I know," Din said again. Differently this time. "I saw." Grogu looked at him with the ancient face. Din had thought, in the long quiet of the first day of flying, about what Grogu's gesture toward the operative had meant. Had thought about the instinct behind it, the simple, uncomplicated extension of an offer toward a being whose buried self the child had felt clearly enough to reach toward. No calculation in it. No tactical assessment. Just the direct response of a creature who moved through the Force and understood what people were underneath the things they had become, and responded to what they were rather than what they presented. He had also thought about what it meant that Grogu had crossed universes to find River Tam. Had thought about the Force's role in that, whether it had been accident or intention, whether the distinction mattered. Had thought about what River had said in the common area at the third hour of Serenity's night cycle, that things didn't happen to Grogu the way they happened to other people. That he was moved by something, and the movement had a direction, and the direction was toward what was needed rather than what was convenient. In a universe without the Force had found the one person who could hear it. And that person was less alone for having been found. Din did not know the theology of it and was not certain theology was the right frame. What he knew was the practical reality. The child moved through existence in a way that left things better than he found them, and this was not an accident of temperament but something deeper, something the 50 years and the training and the ancient species' long relationship with the living current of the universe had built into him at a level below intention. He was, Din thought, exactly what a Jedi was supposed to be. Not the version that had become institutional and rigid and ultimately fragile, that had built such elaborate structures around itself that when the structures fell the thing they were meant to protect fell with them. The original version. The thing underneath the tradition. The simple orientation toward life and connection and the willingness to reach toward what needed reaching toward regardless of whether it was safe or convenient or made any tactical sense whatsoever. Din was not a Jedi. He was a Mandalorian. The two traditions had a complicated history that he was still in the process of understanding. But he had spent enough time with this child to know that some things were true regardless of what tradition you approached them from. Take care of each other. Mal Reynolds had said it as they crossed the docking threshold, quiet and without performance, the way true things were usually said. Din had carried it the entire first day of flying without examining it, and now he examined it and found it was the same thing the armorer had told him when she sent him on the path that led to Grogu, and the same thing the Jedi text said in longer and more formal language, and the same thing Grogu demonstrated every single day without language of any kind. The simplest instruction. The hardest practice. He looked at his son. Grogu had shifted in the co-pilot's cradle and was looking at the star field through the viewport with the quality of attention he gave to things that were simply beautiful, not analyzing, not sensing, just present to them. The stars moved past in the slow drift of standard cruise, ancient and various and entirely indifferent, and Grogu watched them with his ears up and his expression open and his small body settled into the comfortable position of someone who was exactly where they were supposed to be. Din watched him watch the stars. After a while, Grogu turned and looked at Din with the expression that was neither the ancient face nor the child face but the one that was most simply and completely himself. The one that appeared in the quiet moments, in the long flights, in the spaces between events where nothing was required of either of them except presence. His ears moved in the way that meant "I know you're there." "I know," Din said, for the third time. It covered, as it always did, everything. He faced forward. Set his hands on the controls. The outer rim moved past in its ancient silence, vast and patient and full of the things that needed doing, and Din Djarin flew his ship through it toward the next thing and the thing after that, with his son beside him and the Force running wide and deep through everything, connecting all living things in all universes in a single continuous field that had no name adequate to what it was. It was enough. It had always been enough. It was, in the end, the only thing that ever was. In the Georgia system, 3 days after the Razor Crest's departure, Serenity broke from the Kalidasa drift zone and resumed its course toward a job on Persephone that was probably legitimate and definitely paid. The crew ate breakfast in the common area with the particular quality of ordinary that follows extraordinary events, not unchanged, but returned to function, the way a river returned to its course after a flood had passed through it. River Tam sat at the table and listened to the voices around her, Wash's morning energy, Kaylee's cheerful complaints about the port compression coil, Jane's monosyllabic engagement with his food, Mal and Zoe's quiet efficiency, Book's measured presence at the edge of things, and beneath all of it, underneath the noise that had been her entire life, she heard the harmonic. The frequency running below everything, connecting all of it, the current that a small three-fingered hand had shown her was always there, had always been there, would always be there. It was thinner here than it was in his galaxy. She understood that now. A whisper rather than a voice. But it was real, and it was present, and she was not alone in it. She thought about what he had shown her in 40 seconds on a scarred table in the middle of the night. The truth of what everything was. The vast field of connection that made the noise not a burden but a belonging, not the chaos of being overwhelmed by everything but the simple fact of being part of everything, which was different, which was not what she had been told it was, which was not what they had made her carry it as. She thought about a Mandalorian warrior who loved his son with a completeness that required no words because words were insufficient and he knew it and had made his peace with that and found a different language entirely. She thought about a 50-year-old child watching stars. "You're smiling," Mal said, from across the table. He said it with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned not to treat River's moods as problems to be solved. "I know," River said. Mal looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at his coffee. Then he said, with the quiet directness that was his version of tenderness, "Good." Outside Serenity's hull, the Georgia system went about its business. The stars held their positions. The current ran beneath everything. And somewhere across the boundary between universes, in a galaxy that was learning to remember what it had almost lost, a child watched the stars from a ship called home and felt the connection that linked all living things in all places and knew, with the bone-deep certainty of something 50 years old and fully itself, that the field was wide and the field was real and no one who had ever truly felt it was ever entirely alone. Live long and prosper. More stories await.